The chapel smelled like pine resin, candle tallow, and old wood that had soaked up too many winters to ever fully dry out again. It was the kind of smell that settled into the back of your throat and stayed there. Not unpleasant exactly, but permanent. Like the cold itself. Like the mountains pressing in from every side of the valley, gray and indifferent and enormous in a way that made every human problem feel both urgent and meaningless at the same time. Elira Vane stood at the entrance of that chapel and could not make her feet move forward. Behind her, the November wind cut through the gap in the double doors, lifting the hem of her veil and pressing it against the side of her face like a cold hand. She had borrowed the veil from a woman named Doris Peck, who ran the dry goods store 2 streets over. Doris had lent it without being asked, just appeared at the door of the Vane family's rented room that morning, with the veil folded over her arm and her eyes carrying the particular softness of a woman who understood something was wrong but was not going to say so out loud. Elira had accepted it. She did not know what else to do. The dress was her own, dark blue wool with small ivory buttons at the wrist, the only decent garment she owned that wasn't mended at the elbows. She had pressed it the night before with a heated iron wrapped in damp cloth, working by lamplight while her older brother Cade slept in the next room, snoring like nothing in the world was wrong, like tomorrow was just another day. She had wanted to hate him while she pressed that dress. She had wanted to feel something clean and sharp and simple, but instead what she felt was a kind of hollow numbness, the way she imagined it felt to stand at the edge of a very high cliff, not planning to jump, not certain she wouldn't, just standing there and waiting to find out which version of herself would make the decision. Elira. Her brother's voice came from behind her right shoulder, low and practiced in the particular way of a man who had spent years smoothing over the consequences of his own behavior. The minister's waiting. She did not turn around. Elira. His hand came to her elbow, not rough, but not gentle either, just there, steering. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not making anything, she said. Her voice surprised her, flat and quiet and without the trembling she had expected. You made it. I'm just standing in it. Cade said nothing to that. He never had a good answer when she said something true. He just tightened his hand on her elbow and moved her forward, and she let him, because she did not know what the alternative looked like, and she was too tired to imagine one. The pews held maybe 30 people, not friends. Black Hollow was too young a town, and the Vanes too new to it for any of these faces to qualify as friends. They were neighbors in the territorial sense, which meant they occupied the same difficult geography and had therefore developed a passing familiarity with each other's troubles. A few women sat together near the back, their expressions carefully neutral. Several men stood along the side wall, hats in hand, watching with the same flat attention they'd give to a land survey or a livestock auction. That was what this was, Elira realized as she walked the aisle. An auction. The lot had already been called. The price had already been agreed upon. She was simply being delivered. At the front of the chapel, beside the weathered minister whose name she had already forgotten, stood the man she was going to marry. Ronan Mercer. She had seen him twice before this morning. Once at the general store in town, where he had been purchasing rope and lamp oil and had nodded at her without particular interest, the way a man nods at anything that crosses his line of vision. Once at the edge of his property, when Cade had driven her out in the wagon to inspect the arrangement, which was the word Cade used, as though she were a fence post being checked for rot. Ronan Mercer was not what she had pictured when her brother first told her about the debt. She had pictured old. She had pictured ugly. She had pictured the particular brand of entitled cruelty that sometimes wore a respectable face in small frontier towns. She had been steeling herself for all of those things. He was none of them, exactly, and that made him harder to read. I was somewhere in his mid-30s, tall, in the way that mountains are tall, not imposing so much as simply there, taking up the space around him without apparent effort. His face was angular and weathered, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from years of outdoor work and not enough attention to the consequences. His hands, she noticed now as she drew closer, were big and rough-knuckled and marked with old scars she couldn't read the stories of yet. He had made some attempt at presentation, clean shirt, brushed jacket, hair combed back with something that had mostly dried out by now. But he looked profoundly uncomfortable in it, like a man who had dressed for a funeral that turned out to be in his own honor. I was watching her walk toward him, not with hunger, not with satisfaction, not with the proprietary confidence she had been dreading. He was watching her the way you watch something you're not sure you understand, and he had the decency, at least, to look like this was costing him something too. She stopped beside him. The minister began talking. The words moved past her without landing. Lawful, wedded, honor, and cherish, so long as you both shall live. Phrases that had been spoken over enough people in enough different circumstances that they had worn smooth as river stones, all the sharp meaning rubbed away. At some point the minister paused, and Cade pressed the ring into her hand, and she placed it where she was told to place it, and Ronan placed one on her finger, a plain band of silver that was slightly too large and moved when she curled her hand closed. I now pronounce, and then it was done. She was Mrs. Ronan Mercer, and the 30 people in the pews were already reaching for their hats and coats, and her brother was smiling the smile of a man who had settled an account. And the cold came back through the gap in the chapel doors, and Elira stood very still in the middle of all of it, and felt the strange, airless sensation of a future closing like a door. Ronan leaned toward her. She tensed, expecting, she wasn't sure, something claiming, something that would confirm the worst of what she had imagined. But he only bent his head close to hers, so that only she could hear him above the shuffle of departing boots and scraping pew legs, and said in a voice that was low and direct and carried no performance in it at all, "No one owns you under my roof." And then he straightened and turned to shake the minister's hand, and Elira stood there with those 6 words sitting in her chest like stones she hadn't expected anyone to throw. She didn't know what to do with them, so she folded them away and said nothing, because she had learned a long time ago that hope was a thing that needed evidence before it deserved to be spent. The wagon ride out to Ronan's homestead took the better part of 2 hours, following a road that became increasingly generous with the word road the further they climbed from town. What started as rutted dirt faded into tire tracks pressed into frost-hard ground, then into something that was essentially a suggestion of direction through open highland terrain, pine stands on either side growing denser and the sky above them growing more serious. They didn't speak much. Elira sat on the bench beside him, with her single trunk loaded in the wagon bed, her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape. Ronan drove with easy attention, the kind of comfortable silence a man develops when he spends most of his time alone in open country. After a while he said, without preamble, "You can ask me what you want to know." She considered that. "How much did he owe you? Your brother?" He was quiet a moment. "It wasn't my debt directly. He owed Garrett Cole. Cole's the one who suggested the arrangement. And you agreed to it." "I agreed to give Cole the money and take on the terms." He glanced sideways at her. "That's not the same as agreeing with it." "Then why did you?" He looked back at the road. "Because Cole's terms were worse." She thought about that. She turned it over a few times. "What were Cole's terms? Nothing you'd have liked?" "Tell me anyway." He didn't answer immediately. A crow lifted out of the pines to their left, complaining at the noise of the wagon, and veered off toward the ridge. Ronan watched it go. "Cole wanted the debt worked off," he said finally. "Said there were positions available, at a place he operates north of here." He paused. "It's not a place you'd want to work at." The implication settled over her quietly, and she understood it without needing it spelled out, and she sat with it for a long moment. "So you bought the debt," she said. "I bought the debt." "And the terms of your arrangement?" "Are legal ones." He said it firmly, the way you say something when you want it to be clearly on record. "You are my wife in name. I will not pretend that's a comfortable word given the circumstances, but it means my roof, my protection, and your own person, entirely." She looked at him for a moment, at the side of his face, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes stayed steady on the road ahead. "You say that like you mean it. I generally don't say things I don't mean. Takes too much effort to keep track of." Something almost, not quite, but almost, softened at the corner of her mouth. She turned away before it could go any further. "I'll decide what I believe when I see how things are." "That's fair," he said, and he meant that too. The homestead sat in a natural clearing where the ridge curved around and blocked the worst of the north wind, which Elira would later understand was not an accident of geography, but a deliberate choice Ronan's father had made when he claimed the land 15 years prior. The cabin was larger than she had expected. 2 main rooms, a lean-to addition, a proper stone hearth, windows of actual glass rather than oiled cloth. The barn beyond it was solid built, and she could hear cattle moving inside and smell the particular warmth of livestock breath and hay that was, unexpectedly, somewhat comforting. Standing at the edge of the porch, arms crossed against the cold, was a woman of perhaps 60 who assessed Elira with the sharp-eyed candor of someone who had survived enough to earn the right to plainness. "This is Mara Holt," Ronan said. "She's been keeping house here since my father's time. She stays as long as she wants to stay." "Which is until I'm done, not until someone tells me I am," Mara said, not moving from her spot. She looked at Elira. "You're younger than I thought." "Everyone says that," Elira said. "Is it a problem for you?" "No." "Is it a problem for you?" Mara's expression shifted by about 3 degrees towards something warmer, which Elira suspected was approximately the maximum adjustment the woman's face was capable of making. "Come inside. You'll freeze before I finish deciding about you." The inside of the cabin was spare but not unkind. Clean swept floors of rough-cut timber, a table, and 4 chairs that didn't match, shelves of provisions, a cot tucked in the lean-to that Mara explained was hers, and beyond a partition of hung wool blankets, a main bedroom with a bed of iron and rope-strung frame and a patchwork quilt that had been repaired more times than it should have been and was all the better for it. "Your things go here," Mara said, setting down the edge of Elira's trunk. "He sleeps there." She nodded toward a narrow cot tucked against the far wall that Ronan had apparently installed. Recently, from the look of it, the wood of the frame still pale and new. "Until you both figure out what kind of arrangement you have." Elira looked at Ronan. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "I said what I said. I mean, all of it." Mara made a sound that might have been approval or might have been a person clearing their throat. "Supper's in an hour," she said, and left them to it. That first week was the worst kind of awkward. The kind that comes not from hostility, but from 2 people trying very hard to be decent to each other without yet knowing how. They moved around the cabin in separate orbits, polite as strangers at a boarding house, careful with the space between them. Ronan rose before light every morning and was in the barn before Elira had pulled herself fully out of sleep. He came in for meals, ate without complaint, asked occasionally if she needed anything, and returned to work. He was a man of practical focus, the kind who spoke when there was something worth saying and was otherwise content with silence. Under different circumstances, Elira thought she might have found this peaceful. Under these circumstances, she found it impossible to read. She spent those first days trying to find the shape of her situation. Learning the cabin, where things were kept, what Mara's routines were, what the property looked like in daylight, what the rhythm of the place sounded like. She helped Mara with cooking and mending, not because she was told to, but because idleness felt dangerous to her, like standing in a cold room without moving, a slow way to freeze. Mara was not easy company, but she was honest company, which Elira came to value quickly. She didn't soften things, she didn't reassure, but she also didn't lie, and she didn't pretend, and in the economy of trust that Elira was running on, that was worth considerably more than warmth. "You don't like being here," Mara said one evening, without judgment, while they were setting the table. "I don't know where I like being," Elira said. "I haven't had much practice choosing." Mara was quiet for a moment, set down the tin plates. "He's not a bad man." "I know." "That's not the same as saying it's easy." "No." Elira straightened the plates unnecessarily. "It's not." The fight with her brother happened at the end of the second week, when Cade appeared at the homestead unexpected on a gray Tuesday morning, riding a horse that was too good for him and wearing the particular expression of a man who has convinced himself that his guilt is actually just a misunderstanding. Elira had been splitting firewood in the side yard when she heard the hoofbeats. She looked up and saw him coming through the tree line, and she set down the axe and stood where she was and waited, because she had nothing to go toward him for. He dismounted with a kind of theatrical ease. "Elira, you look well." "What do you want, Cade?" He glanced toward the cabin. Is Mercer around?" "He's working the upper pasture. Say what you came to say." Something in her voice made him hesitate, which was unusual. Cade Vane was not a man accustomed to hesitation when it came to his own sister. He had been managing her since their mother died and their father left, which was a long time ago now, and the habit of management had calcified into something he no longer questioned. "I came to see that you're settled, that things are—" "You sold me," she said. The words came out flat and factual, and without the heat she'd expected to feel. Not an accusation, just a record. "You owed money you couldn't pay and you traded me for it. I want you to say that instead of whatever else you were about to say." His jaw tightened. "That's not what—" "Then tell me what it was, Cade. Tell me the word for it." He looked away. at the mountains, at the trees, at anything that wasn't her face. For a moment she saw something genuinely uncomfortable move through him. Not quite regret, not quite shame, but something in that neighborhood, something real. I didn't have another option, he said finally. You always have another option. You just didn't like any of the ones that cost you something. I was in over my head. His voice shifted, took on the defensive edge she recognized. I know what Cole would have done. She picked up the axe. Not threateningly, just with the intention of going back to work. Ronan told me. So don't make yourself the victim of that story. You let it get to Cole in the first place. Elira, go home, Cade. She turned back to the woodpile. Come back when you have something honest to say, not before. She heard him stand there for another minute. She heard him get back on his horse. She heard the hoofbeats retreating through the trees, and she split wood until her arms ached and her breath was coming in white clouds in the cold air. And she didn't cry, which was a small victory, and she was going to allow herself to count it as one. She didn't hear Ronan come up behind her until he was close. I heard some of that, he said. Most of it? Most of it. He stopped a few feet away, and there was nothing in his voice that she could identify as pity, which was a relief. Pity she couldn't have stood. You didn't have to send him off. I know. She set down the axe again. Her hands were shaking slightly, which annoyed her. I wanted to. He nodded. Looked at the wood she'd split, which was considerably more than they needed. You've been working this stack for an hour. I needed something to hit. He almost smiled at that. Fair enough. Come in for coffee when you're done. He turned and went back toward the barn, and Elira stood in the cold yard and breathed and thought about the fact that he had heard her say those things to her brother, and he had not offered her advice or told her to soften it or asked how she planned to repair the relationship. He had just let it be what it was. She went back to splitting wood, but the shaking in her hands was already gone. The snow came seriously in December. By the third week it had packed the yard a foot deep and was still adding to itself with quiet regularity, filling in the gaps between things the way snow always does, making the world simpler and harder in equal measure. The Highlands in winter were a different world than Black Hollow, different even than the farms and settlements lower in the valley. Up here there was no distraction from the reality of what living required. The cattle had to be fed and moved and checked. The firewood had to hold. The provisions had to be managed carefully enough that they'd make it to spring without running short. Everything was cause and consequence, all the time, with very little margin. Ronan moved through it with a steady competence that Elira found herself watching more than she intended to. There was nothing showy about how he worked, no performance of effort, no complaint about the cold or the difficulty. He just did what needed doing, day after day, with a methodical attention that she came to understand was not indifference but focus. He was a man who had learned early that winter didn't care about your feelings, so he developed the habit of keeping them organized and out of the way of the work. She started working alongside him without making a formal decision to do so. It happened in pieces. She took over feeding the smaller stock in the morning because it freed him for the heavier work, and because it got her out of the cabin and moving in the sharp cold, which she found, to her own surprise, she needed. She helped him rope and shift cattle when an early storm pushed them into a tight corner against the north fence. She learned to read the weather signs he read, the way the clouds stacked on the far ridge before a hard fall, the particular stillness that preceded the worst winds. One night in early January, the temperature dropped past anything Elira had experienced before. She woke to the sound of the cattle and found Ronan already pulling on his coat in the darkness. I need to check the far shelter, he said. 2 of the heifers are close to calving. Cold like this. I'll come, she said. He looked at her. In the dim light from the banked fire, she couldn't make out his expression well, but he didn't argue. Dress warm. They walked out into a cold that had physical weight. The lantern he carried made a small gold circle in the dark, and the snow crunched under their boots with a sound like broken glass, and the sky was ferociously clear, every star pressed so hard against the black it seemed like they might fall through. In the far shelter, by lamplight, they sat with the laboring heifers through the small hours, keeping them calm, keeping them warm. One calf came just past 2 in the morning, messy and struggling, and then suddenly there, legs folding and unfolding in the straw, and the mother turning to clean it with a thoroughness that seemed to leave no room for any doubt about what mattered. There, Ronan said quietly. I was tired. She could see it in how he held himself, the weight of too many early mornings and late nights accumulating. But he was watching the calf find its feet with an expression that wasn't quite soft. Ronan Mercer didn't do soft easily, but was something adjacent, something that was just straightforwardly glad. Elira found herself looking at him longer than she meant to, not with anything she was ready to name, just noticing, filing away. You really love this land, she said. He considered that. I don't know if love is the right word. I know it. I know what it needs. He was quiet for a moment. My father cleared this place when it was nothing but timber and frost. He poured 20 years into it. When he died, it was the only thing he left that was worth having. That's a heavy thing to carry. Maybe. He rubbed the back of his neck. Or maybe it just means I know what I'm working for. They sat for a while in comfortable silence in the warm straw smell of the shelter, while the calf learned to stand and the night moved slowly toward morning, and Elira thought, this is what it looks like when a person is rooted to something. She had never been rooted to anything. She had only ever been moved. She didn't sleep that night. But when they walked back across the snow in the gray early light, the darkness full of the coming of dawn, she felt something that was not comfort exactly, but was the distant shape of it, the outline of what comfort might look like if she could get close enough. Well, it was Mara who saw it first, the way Mara seemed to see most things that happened in the orbit of that homestead. You're less like a closed door, Mara said one afternoon in January, apropos of nothing, while they were sorting dried beans at the table. Elira didn't look up from the beans. I don't know what that means. It means when you came here, you walked around like you expected every room to lock behind you. Mara's voice was matter of fact, the way someone describes weather. You're not doing that as much. Elira sorted a few more beans. Noticing doesn't mean trusting. No, but it means you're not completely closed off to the possibility. Elira considered this. It was too accurate for her to dismiss. He's decent, she said finally. I know he is. I raised him after his mother left. Mara said this without particular drama, just information. He's not always easy. He doesn't talk when he should sometimes. He gets himself into a corner on things and won't move when he ought to. But he doesn't lie, and he doesn't break things when he's angry, and he doesn't take what's not offered. She paused. There are worse starting points. There are, Elira agreed. The question is what you do from them. Elira set down a handful of sorted beans. I'm still figuring that out. I know. Mara went back to her side of the sorting. Take your time. Winter's long. Oh, but winter had its own plans, and they did not include waiting. It was the second week of January when Ronan found the children. He had been riding the eastern fence line, checking for storm damage, when he came across the tracks. Small ones. Irregular. The kind that come from cold, stiffened feet that can't move properly. He followed them to the ravine edge and found them there. Two children huddled in the hollow of a fallen pine, sharing body heat in the animal way that children resort to when everything adult has failed them. The girl was perhaps 9. The boy was younger, 6 or 7, hard to tell because he was too thin. They were alive, barely. Ronan got them back to the homestead on his horse and came in carrying them one at a time, the horse too cold and the children too exhausted to manage any other way. And Mara took one look and started heating water while Elira cleared the space near the fire and gathered every blanket in the cabin. The girl came around first. She had sharp eyes, dark and watchful, and already calculating, even half frozen. And when she was warm enough to speak, she told them her name was Ivy, her brother was Silas, and that they had been traveling with their parents. She said this last part in the present tense and then stopped, and something passed behind her eyes that was terrible to see in a child that age. And she didn't say anything more about the parents. Elira didn't push her on it. Silas slept for almost 12 hours. When he woke, he said nothing at all, just looked around the cabin with large, quiet eyes, and eventually accepted the bowl of soup that Mara pushed at him and ate it with total concentration, like a child who had learned not to expect the next meal. Ronan stood in the doorway between the main room and the sleeping area watching them. His jaw was set. Someone will have to ask around, he said to Elira, low, when the children were both settled and Mara was occupied. About family, or, I know, Elira said. It may be there's someone who, I know, Ronan. She looked at where Silas had fallen back asleep by the fire, his small hands curled under his chin. But not tonight. He looked at her for a moment. then nodded once and said nothing more about it that night. The following morning, 3 of the neighboring settlers showed up at the homestead to offer their opinions on the matter. Frank Deller arrived first. He ran the largest ranch in the lower valley, a man of strong views and louder voice, followed by his wife and a man named Harker, who kept a sheep operation on the south side of the ridge. They stood in the yard and made the case that 2 extra mouths were a burden the valley could not sustain, that there were settlements further east with proper facilities. That sentiment was not a plan. Elira listened from the porch. "You're not wrong about the resources," she said when Deller had finished his accounting. "But you're wrong about what the decision is." Deller looked at her with the faint impatience of a man unused to being addressed in this way by someone he had already discounted. "Mrs. Mercer, I appreciate your concern, but they're children," she said. "They're cold and they're frightened and their parents are dead, and this is not a ledger problem." She kept her voice even. Not angry. Anger would give him something to dismiss. "They'll stay until we've done everything possible to find family. And if there's no family, we'll figure out what comes next from there." "And the cost of that," Harker said, not unkindly, "comes from where?" "From where any cost in a hard winter comes from," Elira said. "From everyone doing a little more than they thought they could." There was a silence in the yard. Deller's wife, who had not spoken, was looking at Elira with an expression that was evaluating something. Ronan stood a few feet to Elira's left, arms crossed, not intervening, just present, a fact that was its own kind of statement. "All right," Deller said finally, not entirely gracefully. "Your roof, your decision." "It is," Elira said. When they had gone, she stood in the cold yard for a moment, the wind lifting her hair, and thought about the fact that she had just done that she had stood in front of people she barely knew and said what she believed and not backed away from it, and the world had not collapsed. It was a small thing, she knew that, but it was the first small thing that was entirely her own. Ivy proved harder to win over than the settlers had been. The girl was wary in the way of someone who had learned the hard way that kindness had terms attached, and she spent the first week watching everything and everyone in the homestead with those dark, careful eyes, looking for the catch. She did small, useful things without being asked, helped Mara set the table, swept the hearth, watched Silas with the practiced attention of someone who had been doing it for a long time. But she kept herself at a distance that was polite and impenetrable. Elira didn't push. She understood the architecture of that distance. She had lived inside it herself. What cracked it, in the end, was ordinary. One evening, near the end of January, Elira was sitting by the lamp repairing a tear in one of Ronan's work shirts, and Ivy came and stood near her without saying anything, just watching the work of her hands. "Do you want to learn?" Elira asked. A pause. "It's hard?" "The beginning is. Then it gets easier." Another pause. "Can I try?" Elira moved over on the bench, and Ivy sat beside her, and Elira showed her how to thread the needle and how to start the stitch, and how to keep the tension even, and Ivy's small hands were serious and careful, and she did not give up when the needle slipped or the thread tangled, just started over with the same focused patience she applied to everything. They sat like that for the better part of an hour. Silas slept by the fire. Mara made tea without being asked. Ronan came in from the cold, set his boots by the door, and looked at the 2 of them on the bench and looked away quickly, finding something to be very interested in on the other side of the cabin. "You're good at that," Elira said to Ivy, about the sewing. "My mother was good at it." Ivy didn't look up from the cloth. Her voice was carefully neutral, the way a child's voice is when they are holding something delicate and are afraid of what happens if they grip too hard. She said patience was a skill, not a personality. Elira thought about that. She was right. Ivy was quiet for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she said, "Where did they put her?" After. Do you know how that works? What they do with Ivy?" Elira kept her voice gentle. "We'll find out. Everything that matters, we'll find out." Ivy nodded, just once, and went back to the sewing, and Elira sat beside her in the lamplight and thought that whatever her brother had set in motion and whatever she had expected when she walked into that chapel, none of it had included this. None of it had looked like this. This small, hard, real thing, and she was not sure yet that she would call it a gift, but she could not call it nothing. The winter deepened. The nights ran long and cold, and the mornings required everything that everyone in that household had: And some days were genuinely hard in ways that left no room for anything but the practical. The cattle needed tending, the firewood needed to last. Silas caught a chest cold in the third week of January that kept them all wakeful for 4 nights running until it finally broke, and he slept the long, easy sleep of recovery. In the gaps between the hard things, in the small, ordinary spaces, something else was happening that none of them named or remarked upon, because naming it would have made it fragile. Ronan and Elira were becoming something. Not what they had been to each other in the chapel, not the formal strangeness of those first weeks. Something more honest, built from proximity and shared difficulty and the accumulation of small moments that don't seem like much on their own, but add up in ways you only recognize when you look back. He told her about the land one evening when they were sitting by the fire, both reading, the children asleep, Mara having retired to her lean-to. Not a speech about it, just talking, the way people talk when they're tired and the fire's good and they've run out of reasons to keep things separate. He told her about the seasons here, the rhythms of it, the particular quality of spring when it finally came, the way the light changed on the ridge in late afternoon in July. He talked about it the way you talk about something you love, without being entirely aware that love is the word you're using. She listened. She asked questions, not the polite kind, but the real kind, the ones that come from actual curiosity. And somewhere in the middle of it, she said something about her mother, an offhand thing, a memory of a garden her mother had kept in the years before everything went wrong, and she hadn't talked about her mother in years, and the words came out easier than she expected. He listened. He asked the real kind of question. They talked until the fire burned low and they both noticed it at approximately the same time and looked at each other across the small space between them, and neither of them said what they were both beginning to understand, because it was January and the world outside was still frozen and there was too much ahead of them that was uncertain. But the understanding was there, the way heat is there before a fire is lit, existing as potential, waiting for the right conditions. "We should sleep," Elira said. "Probably," Ronan agreed. Neither of them moved for another 10 minutes. And then they did, and the cabin settled into the specific quiet of a place where several people are learning, slowly and with great difficulty, to trust the space that holds them all. By the end of January, Elira Mercer, technically, though she had still not fully made the name her own, had been in the Highlands for 2 months. She was not the same person who had stood at the entrance of that chapel and could not make her feet move forward. She was not transformed. She had not found peace or resolution or any of the clean, satisfying things that stories sometimes promised were waiting on the other side of hardship. She was still complicated, still watchful, still carrying the shape of all the years she had spent being managed and traded and moved. But she was choosing now. Small choices, most of them. What work she did each morning, how she spoke to the children, what she said to the settlers who came by and how she said it, how she let herself sit in a room with Ronan Mercer and not feel like the walls were moving in. Small choices. Hers. That was enough for January. The spring was a long way off, but it was coming. February came in mean. There was no other word for it. The cold that had settled over the Highlands in January had been serious but manageable, the kind of cold that made everything harder without making it impossible. February was different. February felt personal. The temperatures dropped past anything the settlers in the lower valley had recorded in a decade, and the wind that came off the northern ridge did not behave like wind so much as like something that had made a decision about you and was carrying it out with patience and thoroughness. The cattle lost weight faster than Ronan had budgeted for. He said nothing about it directly, but Elira had learned enough about the way he moved through the homestead to read the difference between his ordinary focused quiet and the specific quality of quiet that meant he was doing calculations in his head and not liking the results. He spent longer at the barn in the mornings. He checked the hay stores twice when once would have been enough if the numbers were good. He came in for supper and ate without tasting it, his eyes somewhere else. "How bad is it?" she asked him one evening when the children were in bed and Mara had gone to her lean-to and the fire had burned down to coals that painted the room in shades of rust and amber. He looked up from the table, where he had been turning a piece of harness leather over in his hands without any apparent purpose. "It's not a crisis yet." "That's different from saying it's fine." He set down the leather. "We're going through hay faster than I planned for. If the cold breaks in the next 3 weeks, we'll be all right. If it doesn't—" He stopped, started again. "I'll need to buy feed." That means money I was holding for the spring fencing work. What happens if the fencing doesn't get done? The north pasture doesn't hold cattle in spring thaw. They push through the weak sections and spread into the timber, and getting them back is 3 weeks of work instead of 3 days. He rubbed his jaw. It's manageable. It's just everything pushes on everything else up here. One bad calculation and it follows you for the rest of the year. Alira thought about that. She thought about the stores she had been inventorying in the back of the cabin, the dried goods and the preserved food, and the careful math she had started doing without telling him about it. I've been going through the provisions, she said. There's more slack than Mara thinks there is. She counts conservative. I understand why, but I think we could stretch some of what we have further than her numbers account for. He looked at her. You've been going through the provisions. For 2 weeks. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure yet. She laid it out for him. The numbers she had worked, the adjustments she had in mind, the places where a different rotation of what they had would reduce waste without reducing the actual caloric value of what they were eating. She had thought it through carefully, the way she thought through everything now that she had the space to think, and she knew the calculations were sound. When she finished, Ronan was quiet for a long moment. That's good, he said finally, simply, without making a production of it. I know, she said. And there was nothing in that exchange that was about being thanked or recognized, just two people sharing information that mattered, and Alira thought that was a more functional form of respect than most people ever managed. They sat with the dying fire for a while longer, and outside the wind pushed hard against the cabin walls, and inside the air was warm and dim and full of the small sounds of a household at rest. And Alira thought that she was beginning to understand what Ronan had meant when he talked about the land the way he talked about it. Not love exactly, but something you could navigate by. Something that stayed where you put it. She was still not sure what to do with that, but she was less afraid of the question than she had been in January. It was Ivy who asked about the parents first. She waited until a Sunday morning when Ronan had gone into Black Hollow for supplies, and Mara was in the barn, and Silas was occupied with the set of carved wooden animals Ronan had produced from somewhere without comment and placed near the boy's sleeping spot, offered, not given, which Silas had seemed to understand was a distinction that mattered. Ivy waited until the cabin was quiet in that particular way that meant the time was right for a real conversation, and then she came and sat across from Alira at the table and folded her hands in front of her and said, "Have you found anything out?" Alira had been expecting it. She had been bracing for it, actually, because she had found something out, and she had been carrying it for 4 days while she worked out how to say it to a child, without breaking what was left of the child's certainty about the world. "Some things," she said carefully. "Do you want to know all of it, or the short version first?" Ivy considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. All of it. So Alira told her. The parents. Alira had sent a letter to the county seat and to the land office 2 weeks prior, and the information that had come back had confirmed what Ivy already knew. In the way children know things they are not allowed to say out loud. The mother had died of fever in a settlement camp 3 days' ride east. The father had died the following week, not from illness, but from a decision he made about how to survive without her, and Alira chose words for it that were accurate without being the kind of accurate that a child shouldn't have to carry. No family on the mother's side that anyone could locate. The father had a brother somewhere in Oregon, but the territory was wide and the letter would take months, and there was no certainty in it. Ivy listened to all of it without expression. When Alira finished, the girl was quiet for a long time, looking at her folded hands. "Silas doesn't know," she said. It wasn't a question. "No. He thinks—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He thinks they went ahead and are waiting for us somewhere. That's what he decided to believe, and I let him." She looked up. Was that wrong? Alira looked at this 9-year-old girl who had been managing her little brother's grief while managing her own, who had been making decisions about what truth he could hold and what needed to be kept until he was stronger, and she thought about the right answer. "No," she said. "That was you protecting him the best way you knew how. Someone will have to tell him eventually." "Yes. Will you help me?" The words came out smaller than Ivy's voice usually was. Not childlike. Ivy didn't do childlike, really, but human, genuinely asking. "When you're ready," Alira said, "I'll be right there." Ivy nodded. She unfolded her hands and refolded them in a different arrangement. She looked out the window at the snow-covered yard. "I don't want to go to Oregon," she said. "The brother. If he writes back." Let's wait and see what he says. But if he's just someone who would take us because it's what you do. She stopped again, and this time what moved across her face was something fiercer. Silas would go because I told him to. He'd go anywhere I said, so I need to be careful about what I decide. Alira thought about all the things she could say to that, all the reassurances and the gentle redirections and the careful hopes. She chose the honest thing instead. You're right, she said. You do need to be careful, and I'm telling you right now that nothing about your situation gets decided without you knowing about it first. Not from this house. I can promise you that much. Ivy looked at her, evaluated her the way she evaluated everything, with those precise dark eyes. And then she said, okay, and got up from the table and went back to where Silas was playing with his wooden animals, and she sat beside her brother and watched him and said nothing. But she leaned her shoulder against his in a way that was so quiet and so complete that Alira had to look away. Ronan came back from Black Hollow that Sunday with feed and supplies, and also, at the bottom of the wagon, under everything else, a length of fabric, dark red wool, the kind you could make a decent winter coat from, that he set on the table without explanation and then began unloading the rest of the wagon. Mara looked at him through the window, said nothing, which was a particular kind of Mara commentary. Alira picked it up. Enough for a coat for Ivy, she calculated, and perhaps a smaller thing for Silas from what was left. She looked at Ronan's back as he carried provisions from the wagon. You're not subtle, Mara said, passing through with an armload of dried goods. I'm not trying to be, Ronan said from outside. Alira folded the fabric carefully and set it aside. She would start the coat that week. She was not going to make a moment out of it. She suspected that was precisely how Ronan had intended it. What? The fight between Ronan and Frank Deller happened at the beginning of the third week of February, and it changed the temperature of the valley in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Deller arrived at the homestead on a weekday morning, which was unusual enough that Alira came out of the cabin when she heard the horse, already reading something tense in the sound of the approach. Deller dismounted fast, which was also unusual. He was generally a man who took his time with arrivals, letting the performance of his comfort work on people. Mercer. He didn't wait for pleasantries. Garrett Cole's been in contact with me. Ronan was standing outside the barn with a length of rope in his hands. He did not change expression. About what? About the valley. The timber rights on the upper ridge. Deller's voice had the quality of a man delivering news he'd already been sitting with long enough to rehearse. He's putting together a group, buying up the claims around here, consolidating operations. He came to me first. And what did you tell him? I told him I'd think about it. Deller pulled his hat off, turned it in his hands. He's offering good money, Mercer, for the timber rights plus first option on the grazing claims. It's not nothing. It's not nothing, Ronan agreed. What does he want in exchange for it? Just the rights. Standard terms. Ronan coiled the rope slowly. Deller, what does Cole actually want? A pause. Deller looked at his hat. He wants the valley. Consolidated. His people running the operations, local owners kept on as labor, basically. Wage hands on land they used to own. He said it plainly, which Alira gave him credit for. But the upfront money is real. And the families who can't afford to buy back in later. That's... Deller stopped. That's a risk, yes. It's not a risk. It's the plan. Ronan's voice was level, not angry, which was somehow more serious than anger. Cole's done this in 2 other valleys north of here. Pays enough up front that people take it, then spends 2 years acquiring everything else he needs. And by the time anyone understands what's happened, they don't have the resources to do anything about it. He dropped the coiled rope on a fence post. He came to you first because you're the biggest operation in the lower valley. If you sell, the smaller holders follow because they think you know something they don't. Deller's jaw tightened. You're saying I'm being used. I'm saying he's smart about who he approaches first. And what would you have me do instead? The edge in Deller's voice now was defensive, the particular defensiveness of a man who already knows the answer and doesn't like it. Nothing yet. Ronan met his eyes. Let me put some conversations together. Give me 2 weeks before you give Cole any kind of answer. A long silence in the cold yard. Alira stood on the porch and did not move and watched Deller work through whatever math he was running, and she thought about Cole's name and the way Ronan had said it, and she thought about what Ronan had told her in the wagon months ago, because Cole's terms were worse, and something cold settled in her that was not the weather. 2 weeks, Deller said finally. After that, I make my own decision. That's all I'm asking. Deller rode away. Ronan stood in the yard for a moment after, looking at the road, and then he turned and looked at Elira on the porch, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before, not fear, but the awareness of what was coming toward them, and the calculation of what it was going to cost. This is about more than timber rights, she said. Yes. This is about everything. Yes. He came up the porch steps, stopped beside her. Cole has wanted to expand his operations into this valley for 2 years. He couldn't do it as long as the landholders were solvent enough to refuse him. Bad winters changed that math. He was looking at the mountains as he spoke, not at her, the way he always looked at things he was thinking seriously about. He's going to push on this, hard, and some families are going to take the money because they need it, and because it's real money right now when nothing else is. And if enough of them sell, then the ones who don't are surrounded, and Cole controls the access routes and the timber and the winter pasture, and eventually not selling becomes impractical. He was quiet for a moment. It's a good plan, if you're him. Elira thought about the settlers she had met in these months. The Harker family on the South Ridge, the 3 homesteads along the eastern approach that had barely made it through January. The widow Jessup, who ran a small dairy operation down in the lower clearing with 2 hired hands she could barely afford. People who were not Frank Deller, people who did not have Deller's margin. People who would look at whatever number Cole put on the table and see a way out of a hole they'd been trying to climb out of for 2 years. You need to talk to them before he does, she said. Ronan glanced at her. Cole's going to go to the smaller holders after Deller. He'll wait to see if Deller moves, and if Deller hesitates, Cole will start picking off the ones who are weakest. She had worked this out even as she said it, the logic of it clear once you accepted the premise of what Cole was doing. You need to be in front of that. And tell them what exactly. Don't take the money. Tell them what taking the money actually means. She turned to face him. You know things about how Cole operates. Tell them, specifically. Don't make it abstract. She paused. And then tell them what the alternative could look like. We don't have an alternative yet. Then we need to build one. He looked at her for a long moment. In the cold light, his face was hard to read, but she had gotten better at reading it over these months. And what she saw was not skepticism. It was the expression of a man who had arrived at the same door from the other direction and was surprised to find someone already standing there. I'm not good at organizing people, he said. It cost him something to say it, she could tell, because he was a man who preferred his own capabilities to be reliably adequate, and admitting a gap was not easy for him. I know, she said. That part isn't your job. Another long moment. Elira, let me help. She said it directly, not as a request for permission exactly, but as a statement of what was going to happen. You know the land and the operations. I can do the rest. He held her eyes for a moment longer. Then he said, all right, and turned and went inside, and Elira stood on the porch in the February cold and looked out at the valley, and understood, with a clarity that was both exciting and frightening, that she had just committed them both to something that was going to be very hard. So began with the Harkers. The Harker family, Amos and his wife Bet and their 3 children, ran sheep on the South Ridge and had the added difficulty of a new baby born in November, which had drained their resources in ways they hadn't fully anticipated. They were not in crisis, but they were close to it, and Elira knew that people close to crisis were the first ones Cole would approach with a number calculated to seem like rescue. She rode out to them on a Wednesday, the sky flat and gray, and the road hard-packed, and she sat with Bet Harker at the kitchen table while Amos stood by the fire listening with his arms folded, and she told them what she knew about Garrett Cole and the 2 valleys north where he had consolidated operations. She was specific. She gave them names of towns. She had gotten these from Ronan, who had pieced together the history from several sources over the past year, and she described what those places looked like now, 3 years after Cole had moved through them. Families that had sold now working their former land at wages that didn't account for the knowledge they'd spent a lifetime building. Men who had owned their operations taking orders from Cole's managers, who understood profit but did not understand the specific, ungovernable reality of mountain ranching. Bet Harker listened with the focused stillness of a woman who has learned to take information seriously when it comes with that kind of directness. He hasn't approached us yet, Amos said when Elira finished. He will. Probably within 2 weeks. And what do you want us to do when he does? I want you to wait, Elira said. Wait and talk to Ronan before you give Cole any kind of answer. That's all I'm asking right now. You said there's an alternative being worked out, Bet said. Yes. What kind? I don't have all the details yet. She was not going to oversell this because people who had been lied to with confident detail could spot it from a distance, and she needed these people to trust her when she came back. What I have is a direction. The specific shape of it takes more conversations. Conversations that need to happen before Cole gets to people. Amos looked at her. He was a skeptical man, not unkind, but not easily moved, and his skepticism was the kind that came from experience rather than temperament. You've been in this valley 4 months, Mrs. Mercer. I know. That's not a long time to be making proposals about how we all ought to run our operations. No, she agreed. It's not. And if you decide I'm not someone worth listening to, that's a reasonable position. She looked at him steadily. But I've been watching this valley since I arrived, and I've been listening to everyone in it, and what I see is a lot of people working very hard in isolation when the actual problem they face is a collective one. Cole knows that. He's counting on it. Amos was quiet. Bet refilled Elira's cup without being asked. It was not agreement, but it was something. 2 weeks, Amos said finally. We'll hold. She made similar visits to 4 more families over the following week, riding out in the cold with Ronan's horse. He used the older mare. He had given her the better one without making a speech about it, and sitting with people at their kitchen tables and telling them the truth about what was coming and asking for patience in return. Some were more receptive than others. The widow Jessup was immediately and fiercely on board because she had heard about Cole from a woman she corresponded with in one of the northern valleys, and she had been waiting for exactly this kind of conversation. 2 of the smaller homestead families were cautious but willing to wait. One man, a German immigrant named Schreiber, who had been in the valley longest of all of them, and who Elira suspected had seen enough in his life to be deeply suspicious of organized anything, listened to her with total silence, and then said, "What does Mercer think of this plan? But he thinks we need to do it. And you're the one going around saying so." Yes. Schreiber looked at her for a long moment with eyes that had been measuring things for many years. "This is different from the woman who came to the chapel in November," he said. It caught her off guard. She hadn't realized Schreiber had been in the chapel. "I was at the chapel in November," she said carefully. "I know, I saw your face." He said it without judgment, just as information. "You looked like someone being moved somewhere against their will." "I was. And now?" She thought about how to answer that. "Now I'm moving myself," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once, the kind of nod that means something. "Tell me what you need." What they were building, what Elira was building, with Ronan working the practical angles and Mara providing the institutional memory of who owed whom what, and who could be trusted to hold to an agreement and who had a history of breaking under pressure, was a cooperative structure, though none of them called it that directly because the word carried political weight they didn't need. The idea was a shared operation, built around the valley's existing resources, but organized around common interests rather than individual ones. Pooled labor during the heavy work seasons, shared access to the timber on the upper ridge, managed as a collective rather than sold off piecemeal. A combined cattle market that would give them enough volume to negotiate terms that individual operations couldn't access alone. And critically, a structure that Cole couldn't pick apart one family at a time, because it was built so that the withdrawal of any one part would affect the others enough that the social cost of selling out would be visible and real. It was not a perfect idea. Elira knew that. It had weaknesses she could see and probably weaknesses she couldn't, and it required a level of sustained cooperation among people who were not naturally cooperative and who had varying levels of trust for each other built on a complicated history she was only partly informed about. There were people in this valley who had disputes that went back years. Fence line arguments, water rights disagreements, the particular concentrated grievances that develop when people live close to each other under hard conditions for a long time. But imperfect plans were still plans, and they had approximately 10 days before Cole started making his approach in earnest. So imperfect was what they had. "Deller's the piece. I can't figure," Ronan said one evening when they were sitting at the table with papers between them. Notes, figures, sketches of the valley with land claims marked. Ivy had gone to sleep, but Silas was still up, sitting near the fire with one of the wooden animals in his hand, apparently uninterested in anything the adults were saying, but present in the way that children are present when they don't want to miss something. He's got enough operation to stay independent of Cole without the cooperative. He doesn't need us. He needs the timber access, Illyra said. His south pasture is getting overgrazed. He's been pushing into the lower timber for winter fodder for 2 years. If Cole consolidates the upper ridge and controls the access points, Deller's operation degrades. She had worked this out from conversations with Bet Harker, who had made an observation about Deller's grazing patterns that Illyra had filed away. He might not see it that way yet, but it's true. Ronan looked at the papers. You've been listening to everyone. That's what I do. She said it matter-of-factly. It was not a boast. It was just what it was. I watch, and I listen, and I put things together. I've done it my whole life because it was the only way to know what was coming before it got here. I was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers, and then he looked up at her, and there was something in his expression she didn't quite have a name for. Something careful and direct at the same time, something that was trying to say a thing without making it too large for the moment. You're good at this, he said. I know, she said, in the same tone she had used months ago when he had said it about her provisions calculations. And then, after a moment, because the fire was low and the cabin was quiet and Silas had fallen asleep by the hearth without anyone noticing. I didn't know I was before. I never had anything to be good at, nothing that was mine. The quiet after that was a different quality than their usual quiet. Ronan looked at her for a moment longer and then looked back at the papers, and she knew he was not going to push at that because he understood, in the way he seemed to understand most things about her without being told, that she had offered it, and that was enough, and anything more would make her regret having said it. We should talk to Deller, he said, together. Yes, she said. Tomorrow. The conversation with Frank Deller happened the following afternoon in Deller's own kitchen, which was larger than Illyra had expected and considerably more comfortable. His wife, Clara, was a woman of serious domestic organization, and the Deller household ran with a clockwork efficiency that Illyra recognized as the product of years of careful management. Clara served coffee and then sat at the table herself rather than retreating, which Illyra noted and approved of. Ronan laid out the framework of the cooperative in broad terms. Deller listened with the closed expression of a man reserving judgment. When Ronan finished, Deller was quiet for a moment. This is a considerable ask, he said. It is, Ronan agreed. You're asking me to tie my operation to families whose resources are, he paused, choosing the word with care, considerably more limited than mine. I'm asking you to recognize that your operation and those families face the same threat, Illyra said. Deller looked at her. She held his eyes. And I'm asking you to consider what your south pasture looks like in 3 years if Cole controls the timber access on the ridge. A silence. Clara Deller looked at her husband with an expression that conveyed she had already done this calculation independently. That's a very specific thing to bring up, Deller said slowly. It's a specific problem. Illyra kept her voice even. You're a smart man, Mr. Deller. You've built a strong operation, but strength requires forage, and forage requires access. And access is what Cole is going to sell you back at a price you won't like. Another silence, longer. Clara reached over and refilled her husband's coffee cup. Deller watched his wife's hand do this, and something moved in his face that was harder to name. Not the land calculations, but something that was about what you hold on to and why. What do you need from me specifically? He said. And that was the question that meant they had him, or at least had his attention, which was the necessary first thing. By the end of February's 3rd week, they had commitments, qualified, cautious, conditional, but commitments, from 6 of the 9 families they had spoken to. Schreiber was in with something that was as close to enthusiasm as his nature allowed. Jessup was in fully. The Harkers were in once Bet had made Amos sit with the numbers long enough. Deller was in with reservations, which meant he was in as long as the terms didn't disadvantage him significantly, which was the kind of in they could work with. 3 families they hadn't reached yet, and somewhere to the east, on the road that led down from the county seat and into the valley, Garrett Cole was running his own calculations. Illyra knew they were running out of room. She was walking back from the Jessup place on a Wednesday afternoon. Ronan had taken the horse to check on a fence section that had been worrying him when the thaw came. Not a full thaw, nothing so generous as that, But the temperature moved in a single afternoon from punishing to merely cold, and the quality of the air changed in the way it changes when winter decides to relax its grip. Not entirely, but enough to remember that it would have to let go eventually. The snow in the yard sat heavy and wet rather than brittle. The sky was a particular shade of gray that was lighter than it had been for months. She stood in the yard and tilted her face up at that sky, and breathed the changed air, and thought about all of it. The children sleeping inside, Mara's commentary that passed for affection, the 6 families who were now invested in something she had started building in a February kitchen conversation, the man who was out checking a fence line because it mattered to him whether it held. Her brother had traded her future away to erase a debt she hadn't made, and she had taken that traded future and built something in it that was starting to have the shape of something real. She didn't know yet if it was going to hold. There was still Cole. There were still 3 families uncommitted, and there was still the long question of what happened when Cole arrived in the valley in person and made his case with whatever number he had decided was sufficient. There was still all of it, waiting. But the air was different today, and she was standing in her own yard, and nothing about that was someone else's choice. It was Silas who finally spoke about his parents. It happened on a Sunday at the end of February, in the particular quiet of an afternoon when the snow had gentled to flurries, and the cabin was warm, and Mara had made something with dried apples that smelled like autumn. He was sitting with his wooden animals arranged in a pattern on the floor that seemed to have a logic to it. Only he understood, and Ivy was on the bench with her sewing. She had taken to it with a focus that was remarkable, her small hands careful and steady. And Elira was at the table with her notes, and Ronan was sitting by the fire with a piece of harness work in his hands, not talking, just present. Silas looked up from his animals and said, in his small, serious voice, "Are they coming?" The room went still. Not dramatically, none of them were dramatic people by nature, but still in the way that all occupants of a space become simultaneously aware of the same thing at the same moment. Ivy's hand stopped on her sewing. She looked at her brother. She looked at Elira. Elira held Ivy's eyes for a moment and read the question in them, and she made a small, careful nod, the kind that means, "I'm here, I've got you, we can do this." "Silas," Ivy said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "Come sit with me." The boy got up from his animals, trailing one of them in his hand, a carved horse, and went to his sister, and sat beside her on the bench. Ivy put her arm around him with a practiced ease that came from having done it so many times it was no longer a conscious act. "Mama and Papa aren't coming," Ivy said. She said it the way she said most hard things, directly, without dressing it in softer words, because she understood that softer words sometimes made the landing harder. "They got sick. They both got very sick, and they didn't get better." Silas looked at the carved horse in his hand. He turned it over once. His face was very still, the face of a child processing something larger than his vocabulary could contain. "They're not going to be somewhere waiting for us?" he said. "No, sweetheart." A long pause. Outside, the flurries had stopped, and the late afternoon light came through the cabin window in a bar of winter-pale gold. "Okay," Silas said, and then after another moment, "Can I still keep the horse?" It was such a Silas thing to say, so practical, so focused on the concrete thing he could hold, that something broke open slightly in the room. Not tears, not yet, but the slight release of tension that comes when a thing that's been held in suspension finally lands. "Yes," Elira said. "The horse is yours." Silas nodded, satisfied with this in the specific way of someone who has organized what they can organize and set aside the rest for later. He stayed tucked under Ivy's arm for a while, and Ivy held him, and Ronan set down his harness work and looked at the fire, and Mara appeared in the doorway from the lean-to and stood there for a moment, and then went back without saying anything, which was Mara's version of being present. That night, after the children were asleep, Elira sat at the table with her notes without reading them, and Ronan came and sat across from her with his coffee. And for a while they just existed in the same space without it needing to be anything. "He's going to be all right," Ronan said finally. "I know." She looked at her notes without seeing them. "They both will. They're resilient in a way that's almost hard to look at sometimes." "Yeah." She looked up. "Do you want them to stay?" He met her eyes. "I assumed that was already decided." "By me. By you and by what's right." He held her eyes steadily. "They stay. As long as they need to. As long as they want to. This is not a question I'm going to revisit." She looked at him for a moment. At the man who had told her on their wedding day that no one owned her under his roof, who had bought a length of red wool and left it on a table and walked away from it, who came in from the cold without complaint and checked on sick calves at 2 in the morning and listened when she talked about provisions and valley politics with the same focused attention he gave to everything that mattered. She thought about the word she had been not using since January. She set it aside again, not because it wasn't beginning to be true, but because there was still coal coming and 3 families uncommitted and all the uncertain architecture of what they were building. And she had learned the hard way that hope required evidence, and she was still gathering it. But the weight of February was lifting, by degrees. And that was something. March arrived without ceremony, which was appropriate because the valley had stopped expecting courtesy from the weather a long time ago. The thaw that had softened the air at the end of February did not hold. It rarely did this far into the highlands. And the first week of March brought a final hard freeze that killed the false optimism and settled back into the serious cold with the patience of something that had been here long before anyone arrived and expected to be here long after. But the light was changing. That part was real. The days were longer by measurable minutes now, the afternoon sun staying above the ridge a little later each evening, and even when the temperature didn't reflect it, that longer light did something to people who had been living under the short gray days of deep winter. It reminded them that the season was moving, even when it didn't feel like it. It gave them something to work toward. Elira needed that, because the work ahead of her was considerable. Garrett Cole arrived in Black Hollow on a Tuesday, which she found out from Mara, who found out from Doris Peck at the dry goods store, who had heard it from the man at the livery when Cole's people came in to stable 3 horses. He had brought 2 associates with him, men whose specific function Ronan described, with careful understatement, as persuasion of the physical kind when the financial kind hadn't landed. He had taken rooms at the boarding house and had already sent a letter to Frank Deller requesting a meeting. "How much time do we have?" Elira said, when Ronan brought her this information. "He'll want to meet with Deller first. Then he works his way through the valley." Ronan was at the table, his hands flat on the surface in front of him, thinking. 4 days if Deller stalls him, 2 if Deller doesn't. Deller will stall. She was fairly confident about this. Their conversation with him had ended with something that was not quite commitment but was genuine consideration, and she had seen something in Clara Deller's face across that kitchen table that told her the conversation between husband and wife afterward had gone in their favor. But we need the other 3 families before Cole gets to them. The 3 families still uncommitted were the ones Elira had been most uncertain about from the beginning. Old Henrik Strand ran a small logging operation on the northwest corner of the valley, a man of 70 who had been in the mountains since before most of the other settlers arrived, and who trusted the cooperative of his own 2 hands and nothing else. The Calloway brothers, 2 of them, unmarried, mid-40s, who ran cattle on the east approach with an efficiency that came from decades of doing exactly what worked, and nothing more, were skeptical of any arrangement that required them to factor other people's failures into their own planning. And there was a family named Prentice who had arrived in the valley only 8 months prior, had spent those 8 months barely keeping their heads above water, and had the specific vulnerability of people who were desperate enough to take any offer that looked like solid ground. Elira had been most worried about the Prentices from the beginning. They were the Coles' best opportunity in the valley. Young, struggling, without the deep roots that gave other families the patience to evaluate long-term versus short-term. She had ridden out to them twice already. Both times the husband, Thomas Prentice, had listened politely and said he would think about it, which was the diplomatic version of "nothing has convinced me yet." She made one more attempt on Wednesday morning, this time alone, leaving before Ronan was fully out of the barn. The Prentice homestead was smaller than the others, a cabin that was competently built, but had the unfinished quality of a place where the owners had been too tired to get to the second list of things that needed doing. A woodpile that was lower than it should have been for early March. A kitchen garden layout staked out in the frozen ground, with the particular hopeful precision of people planning their way through difficulty. 2 young children visible through the window, faces appearing and disappearing in the glass with the natural curiosity of children who didn't know enough to be worried yet. Margaret Prentice opened the door before Elira reached the porch. She was a woman of perhaps 25, practical-faced, with the shadows under her eyes that came from months of stretched resources and insufficient sleep. "Mrs. Mercer," she stepped back to let Elira in. "Thomas is out back. I'll speak with both of you if that's all right." Margaret looked at her for a moment and then called out through the back wall, and Thomas Prentice came in from whatever he'd been doing with snow on his boots and the slightly braced expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and had not fully decided how he felt about it. They sat at the table. Elira did not lead with the cooperative. She led with Cole. She told them what she knew about his operations in the northern valleys. And this time she had more specific information than before, because Ronan had spent the past 2 weeks corresponding with contacts and had gathered enough detail to make the picture considerably more concrete. She told them about a family named Bauer in the White Pine Valley, who had sold their grazing rights to Cole for a number that felt like salvation, and within 18 months were working their own former land for wages that didn't cover what they'd been making before, because Cole had restructured the operation and moved their cattle out and converted the grazing to timber extraction, which paid him better. She told them about a man named Foss, who had tried to buy his rights back after understanding what had happened, and found that the price had tripled, and the terms included conditions that made the buyback practically impossible. Thomas Prentice listened with the still face of a man who was good at not showing what he was thinking. Margaret Prentice did not have the still face. Margaret's face showed exactly what she thought about the Bauer family, and the man named Foss, and what their situation said about their own. "He's going to come to us," Elira said finally. "He may have already sent a letter, and the number he's going to offer is going to be real money, and you're going to feel it in your chest when you hear it, because you've been in the cold a long time, and real money is hard to say no to." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend I don't understand that." Thomas finally spoke. "What the cooperative is offering isn't money now, it's structure, for later." "Yes, we don't have a lot of later left to spend," he said. "If this winter doesn't end soon, I know." She held his eyes. "Tell me specifically what you're short on. Not generally, specifically." A pause. The admission of specific need was harder than the general acknowledgement of difficulty, and she watched him work through the hesitation of pride before he named the things: feed, seed for the spring planting, enough cash to cover the labor he needed to get the garden properly established before late frost made it too late. She had anticipated some of this. She had talked to Ronan about it before she came. "Ronan will extend feed from the Highland stock at cost," she said. "Not charity. It goes on account against your first season contribution to the cooperative. The seed I can source through the group purchasing we've already set up with the Harkers." She kept her voice practical. Not generous, not magnanimous, practical. Because the Prentices were proud people and they didn't need a benefactor. They needed a structure that treated their participation as valuable rather than their suffering as pitiable. "The labor you need in spring you'll get from the cooperative's shared work schedule. And what you contribute when you're on your feet goes back out to the next family that needs it." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. Thomas looked at Margaret. Margaret was looking at her hands. "Why would you do this?" Thomas said. Not suspicious exactly, but needing to understand the mechanism. "Because if you take Cole's money and Cole ends up with your section of the East approach, the cooperative loses an access route that matters to how the whole thing functions." She said it plainly. "This isn't only generosity, it's that your situation and ours are connected, and I'd rather deal honestly with that than pretend it's purely altruistic." Something in Thomas Prentice's face settled. The honesty of it reached him in a way that softer persuasion hadn't. "All right," he said. "We're in." Margaret looked up. Her expression was something that was working very hard not to be relief, and not quite succeeding. Elira rode back to the homestead with the Prentices behind her and 2 more visits to make before Cole got his footing in the valley, and she thought about what it had taken to say the true thing instead of the comfortable thing, and she thought that her mother had been right all those years ago when she'd said that patience was a skill and not a personality. Her mother had been right about a lot of things, and had not had nearly enough time to teach them all. Old Henrik Strand was a different problem entirely. I was not vulnerable to Cole's money the way the Prentices had been, because he was old enough not to care about the future in the same way. And he had enough cash reserves from 30 years of careful operation that no number Cole put on the table would feel like rescue. What he cared about was his independence, which was absolute and had been absolute since the day he claimed his land and built his first structure with his own hands and decided that was the correct way for a person to live. I was also, Elira had come to understand, the person in the valley with the longest memory. She went to him on Thursday afternoon, as the light was already beginning its descent behind the western ridge. He was in his wood shop, a separate structure from the cabin, smelling of fresh-cut timber and linseed oil, planing a board with the focused attention of a man for whom the quality of the work was the entire point. He glanced up when she came in. Did not stop planing. Mrs. Mercer. Mr. Strand. She looked around the shop. The walls were hung with tools that were old but maintained with an exactness that told you everything about the man who used them. You do good work. I know. He said it simply, not with vanity, just acknowledgement of a fact. You came to talk about the cooperative. Yes, I've heard about it from 3 people already. He turned the board, examined the edge with his thumb. Harker, Jessup, Schreiber. He paused. Schreiber speaking well of a collective arrangement is one of the stranger things I've heard in 30 years. He's practical. I is. Strand set down the plane, looked at her directly with the particular quality of attention that very old people sometimes have. Not impatience, but the specific gravity of someone who knows their time is not unlimited and has stopped wasting it on circling the point. What do you want from me? Same as the others. Your commitment to hold before Cole approaches you, and your participation if the cooperative comes together. I don't need the cooperative. No. But the cooperative needs you. She said it honestly. You have the Northwest Timber access. Without it, the Upper Ridge operation has a gap Cole can exploit. He doesn't need to buy your land. He just needs to make sure you don't cooperate with anyone, and that's enough to create a problem. Strand looked at her. You've thought about this carefully. I've had time. He picked up the plane again. Not to use it, just to hold it, the way people hold things while they think. I have been in this valley longer than anyone who's in your cooperative. I have seen people make agreements they couldn't keep. I have seen, he paused, looking for the right word, collective schemes that were well-intentioned and fell apart when the personal interests of the people in them diverged. I know that's a real risk. It's not only a risk, it's a pattern. He looked at the tool in his hand. What makes yours different? She thought about the question seriously before she answered. I don't know that it is, in some fundamental sense, she said. People are people. Interests diverge. Hard years make everyone smaller. She held his eyes. But Cole's approach makes people smaller faster. It takes the divergence and the difficult years and uses them. At least this way, the valley has a structure that gives people reasons to hold together instead of reasons to separate. She paused. That's not a guarantee. It's just a better starting condition. Strand was quiet for a long time. He turned the plane over in his hands. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the last light was going from the sky, and the shop felt enclosed and warm in the way of a space that has been used and inhabited for many years. My daughter thinks I should retire and go to Portland, he said, apparently out of nowhere. Elira waited. I have told her this is not happening. He set the plane down on the bench with a deliberate finality. I built this place. It does not retire. He looked at Elira. You may put my name on your cooperative. Tell them I said the Northwest Timber access stays in the collective arrangement, as long as the collective arrangement is worth participating in. If it stops being worth it, I withdraw. That is my term. That's a fair term, Elira said. It is. He picked up his plane again. You should get back before the light goes. The West Road ices over in the evening. She left him to his work and rode back through the darkening valley and thought that the Calloway brothers were next, and she was running out of days. The Calloways did not take a meeting. She knew they wouldn't. They were men who made decisions based on what they could observe directly, not on what someone came to their door to tell them, and the most effective approach was to let them observe something worth concluding from. So instead of writing to them, she arranged for the cooperative's first joint work session to happen on the eastern approach, where their property bordered the Harkers, and she made sure the session was organized well enough and productive enough that it was visible from the Calloway fence line. It was Ronan's idea, actually. He suggested it one evening with the quiet casualness he used when he'd been thinking something through for a while and had arrived at a point of enough confidence to say it. They respect competence, he said. Show them the thing works before you ask them to join it. So on Saturday morning, 14 people, men and women both, from 6 different homesteads, gathered on the Harker-Mercer property line and spent the day repairing the shared fence sections that the winter had damaged, working through a rotational system that Elira had mapped out to make the best use of different skill sets, and doing it efficiently enough that they finished in a day what would have taken any one family 3. The Calloway brothers were observed on their fence line 3 times during the day, watching. They never came over. They didn't need to. On Sunday evening, the older Calloway brother, Ellis, appeared at the homestead door and told Ronan they were in, stated their conditions clearly and without preamble, shook hands, and left. That was all of them. Cole made his first move on a Monday. He went to the Prentices first, which told Elira he had done his own intelligence work, because the Prentices had been the most obvious vulnerability in the valley, and Cole was a man who understood where to apply pressure. The number he offered Thomas Prentice was, by Thomas's own account when he came to the homestead afterwards, still slightly shaken by the size of it, more money than the Prentices had ever seen in a single sum. Thomas Prentice had said no. He told it to Elira and Ronan with the particular combination of pride and residual nausea that comes from saying no to something very large when you are not entirely sure you've made the right decision. He tried to tell me the cooperative wasn't real, Thomas said, that it was just talk, that in 6 months Mercer would have moved on to something else and I'd be standing there with nothing. What did you say? Elira asked. I told him to go talk to Schreiber. Something shifted in Thomas's expression that was, cautiously, satisfaction. He didn't seem to like that answer. Cole went to Strand next. Strand told him to get off his property. Cole went to the Calloway brothers, who offered him coffee, listened to his proposal in complete silence, declined, and returned to their work. Cole went to the Harkers. He went to Jessup. Each time he came with a number calibrated to the specific situation of the family he was approaching, and each time the answer was no. By Wednesday, the pattern was clear enough that Cole understood what had happened, and by Wednesday afternoon he was at the Mercer homestead. Elira was in the yard splitting firewood when he arrived. She had gone back to it, that particular activity, because some things were useful for both fuel and thinking, and she set down the axe and stood where she was and watched him dismount. He was a well-dressed man, which she had expected, with the groomed certainty of someone accustomed to rooms where things went his way. He was not physically large or overtly threatening, which was somehow worse. He had the look of a man whose violence was always conducted by someone else. Mrs. Mercer. He took off his hat. The politeness was practiced but technically adequate. I was hoping to speak with your husband. He's in the barn. But I'm the one you need to speak to. A brief pause while he recalibrated. I see. Do you want coffee, or are you here to skip to the thing you came to say? He chose to skip to the thing. He talked about the cooperative in terms that were designed to sound reasonable and slightly concerned, collective arrangements that lacked legal structure, the risks of informal agreements, what would happen to the families in the valley if the whole thing didn't hold together the way they were hoping. His voice was steady, and his points were not without some validity, which was the most dangerous kind of argument. Elira let him finish. You've done this twice before, she said. The White Pine Valley and the Creston Range. And the families who sold to you are still there, working their own former land at wages that didn't account for what they'd spent 20 years learning. She looked at him steadily. We know about the Bauer family specifically, and Foss. Something moved across Cole's face. Not guilt. She didn't think guilt was part of his functional vocabulary, but the recalibration of a man who had arrived expecting to be the most informed person in the conversation and had discovered he wasn't. I'm not sure where you're getting your information. From people you did business with, she said. People write letters, Mr. Cole, even in remote valleys. She picked up the axe, not as a statement, just because it was hers. The arrangement in this valley isn't informal, and it isn't held together by hope. It has a structure that involves shared resource access, documented terms, and 9 families who have agreed to those terms in writing. This was slightly ahead of where things actually were, but the writing part was going to be true by the end of the week, and she was going to make it true by then if she had to stay up every night until Friday. You can make your offer to any of them if you want to, but you should know that the terms of the cooperative include a provision that any member who sells significant assets to an outside buyer within the first 3 years triggers a review of all shared access agreements. This provision had not existed before this conversation. It was going to exist by Friday. So the math of selling to you isn't just about the upfront number. It's about what they lose in access rights afterward. Cole was quiet. Ronan had come out of the barn at some point during this and was standing 30 feet away. He had not moved closer or said anything. He was just present, which was its own kind of statement. You've been busy, Cole said. We've all been busy, Elira said. It's been a hard winter. Cole looked at her for a long moment with the particular attention of a man who is recording something for use later. Then he put his hat back on. The offer to the valley stands, he said. Families can come to me individually. My door is open. I'm sure it is, Elira said. Safe travels. He rode away. Elira stood in the yard and watched him go, and the axe was heavy in her hand and her heart was going faster than she would have liked, because she was not entirely certain any of what she'd said was going to hold, and she knew Cole was not done. Ronan came up beside her. That provision, he said, about the review of shared access. It doesn't exist yet. I know. A pause. When were you going to tell me about it? Approximately 30 seconds before Cole arrived, she said. I decided on the way in from the woodpile. He looked at her. His expression was complicated in ways she'd gotten better at reading. There was something there that was not quite exasperation and not quite admiration, and was mostly the expression of a man who had learned that this woman's mind moved faster than his, and had decided that was a fact to be lived with rather than argued against. We need to write that provision down, he said. Tonight, she agreed. They went inside. The document, the formal structure of what would eventually become the Black Hollow Valley Cooperative, was written over 3 evenings at the kitchen table by lamplight, with Mara occasionally appearing over their shoulders to suggest that a particular phrase was too complicated and should be made simpler, and with Ivy sitting at the edge of the table doing her sewing with such apparent inattention that it took Elira 3 evenings to realize the girl was listening to every word and filing it away. It was not a perfect document. It had gaps they hadn't anticipated, and ambiguities that would cause arguments later, and terms that were, in retrospect, slightly naive about the ways people behave when conditions change. But it was real, it was specific, it said what it meant, and it had a signature line at the bottom that would carry weight in a territory court if it ever needed to. Ronan signed it, Elira signed it. By the end of the week, all 9 families had signed it. She held the document that Friday evening, all 9 signatures on the pages in front of her, and thought that 4 months ago she had been standing at the entrance to a chapel, unable to make her feet move forward. She thought about the particular texture of that paralysis. Not physical fear exactly, but the specific terror of a person who has never been given a choice, and has therefore no practice in making one. She had been practicing. The document in her hands was made of practice. It was made of every conversation she'd had at kitchen tables, and every calculation she'd run, and every time she'd said the hard, honest thing when the softer version would have been easier. It was made of Silas's carved horse, and Ivy's careful stitches, and Mara's commentary that passed for affection, and the night in the barn when a calf found its legs in the lamplight. It was not everything. There was still Cole, who had not given up. She was not naive enough to believe that one conversation in a yard had ended anything. There were still the uncertain seasons ahead, and the gaps in the cooperative's structure, and the reality that agreements on paper were only as strong as the people who held to them when things got hard. But it was something that had not existed in November, and she had built it. The violence, when it came, was not dramatic. That was the thing about real violence in real places. It didn't announce itself with the buildup a person might expect. It arrived in the ordinary texture of a regular day, tucked into something that should have been unremarkable. It was a Wednesday in the 3rd week of March. 2 of Cole's associates, the men Ronan had described as his physical persuasion, the ones who'd come into the valley with him, appeared at the Harker property in the evening and put 3 of Amos Harker's sheep through a fence section that bordered the shared access road. Not an accident. The fence section was intact before they arrived and broken in a specific way when Amos found it, the kind of break that comes from a tool applied deliberately rather than from an animal pushing through. The sheep were recoverable. The fence was fixable. The message, which is what it actually was harder to manage. Amos Harker came to the homestead the following morning, looking like a man who had not slept. Bet was with him, which told Elira the conversation had moved past what Amos could handle alone. They sat at the table and Amos laid it out plainly, and when he finished, the cabin was quiet for a moment. He wants us to know he can reach us, Ronan said. I wants us to know it's easier to take the money, Elira said. Amos looked between them. I'm not taking the money. I'm not saying that. He pressed his hands flat on the table, the gesture of a man steadying himself. But I have children on that property. Bet's there alone for half the day when I'm working the south pasture. I need to know what we're dealing with. You're dealing with a man who has reached the end of his legitimate options in this valley and is now trying the next set, Illyra said. She kept her voice level because Amos needed steadiness from her right now, not matching agitation. He's not going to escalate past intimidation. Not here, not now. She said this with more certainty than she felt. Because if anything serious happens on cooperative property, it becomes a territorial matter. And Cole has enough legal exposure in the northern valleys that he cannot afford a territorial investigation. You're sure of that? Amos said. She was about 70% sure. Yes, she said. Ronan looked at her. She looked back at him, the same long-practiced exchange they'd developed over these months. The one that said, I know, but this is what's needed right now. He turned to Amos. I'll ride the shared fence lines with you this week. We go together, both operations. If Cole's people are watching for isolated targets, they can watch two people who won't be isolated. He paused. And we take it to the county sheriff. On record. Not because it'll solve anything immediately, but because we start building the paper. Amos nodded slowly. Something in him settled. Not all the way, not fully, because the fear was real, and it was going to stay real until the situation changed, but enough to work with. When they had gone, Illyra stood at the window and watched the Harkers ride back down the road toward the lower valley, and thought about the certainty she had performed and the 70% that was behind it, and the 30% she was holding in a separate room in her mind and not looking at too directly. Mara appeared beside her. You weren't sure, the old woman said. No. But you said it anyway. Amos needed to be able to sleep, Illyra said. He can't sleep if I'm uncertain. He can sleep if I'm steady. She watched the Harkers disappear around the tree line. And if I'm wrong about Cole's limits, I'll deal with that when it's in front of me. Mara was quiet for a moment. You've changed, she said. Everyone does. Not everyone changes toward something. Mara picked up the coffee pot from the hearth. Some people just change away. Illyra thought about the chapel in November. The paralysis at the entrance. The dress she'd pressed in lamplight while her brother slept without guilt in the next room. She thought about all the versions of herself that had been managed and moved and traded, and she thought about what it felt like to stand in a yard and speak to a man like Cole without the ground shifting under her feet. I had things to change toward, she said, and she left the window and went back to the table, because there were still terms to add to the cooperative document, and Cole was not done yet, and the spring was still coming, whether she was ready or not. The community meeting happened on a Friday evening at the end of March. All 9 cooperative families gathered in Deller's barn, the largest available space, with lanterns hung from the rafters, and hay bales arranged in an approximation of seating and the smell of cattle and winter hay making the air thick and real. Illyra had not planned to speak first. She had planned to let Ronan open it and Deller anchor it, because both of them carried more standing in the valley than she did by simple measure of time spent here. But when the families had all arrived and settled and the expectant quality of a room waiting for direction had filled the space, she looked at Ronan and he looked at her, and she understood from his expression that he thought she should do it. She did not entirely agree with him, but she went ahead. She stood in the middle of the barn and looked at the faces around her. Amos and Bet Harker, the Calloway brothers, with their arms crossed in identical posture. Jessup sitting straight-backed on a hay bale like she was in a board meeting. Schreiber, with his expression of reserved evaluation. Strand in the back near the door, as if maintaining the option of exit. Thomas and Margaret Prentice, with their hands close enough together that they were nearly touching. Deller in the front with Clara beside him, and all the others. She told them what Cole had done at the Harker property. She told them about the conversation in her yard. She told them that Cole was not going to leave immediately, and that the next weeks were going to be the proving season for what they had signed on paper, and that proving seasons were always uncomfortable, and that she was not going to pretend otherwise. He's counting on some of us deciding the trouble isn't worth it, she said. That's his entire strategy at this point, because the other strategies haven't worked. He needs one family to fracture, and then he uses that fracture to suggest the whole structure is soft, and then the doubt spreads. And eventually he gets what he couldn't buy outright. She looked around the room. That is a legitimate plan. It has worked for him before. The only reason it won't work here is if it doesn't work on any of us. Not on the weakest point. Not on the most frightened point. None of us. The barn was quiet. I've been here 5 months, she said. I know that's not long. Some of you have been in this valley longer than I've been alive, And you know things about this land and this community that I don't know yet and probably won't for years. She was not going to pretend a history she didn't have. But I know what I've seen since November. I know what this valley is capable of when the people in it decide to work in the same direction. She paused. And I'm asking you to hold that direction for a little longer. Because Cole is almost out of moves, and the one that's left to him is waiting for us to do his work for him. Nobody spoke for a long moment after she finished. Then Jessup said, from her straight-backed hay bale, I held through 2 bad winters and a bad husband, and I didn't break for either. I'm not breaking for Cole. Something moved through the room at that. Not dramatic, more like a collective breath released. Old Strand said, from the back near the door, same. Ellis Calloway said, same. The word moved around the room in different voices, and it was not a roar and it was not a dramatic proclamation. It was just a series of people deciding, quietly and with full knowledge of what they were deciding, to hold the thing they'd signed on paper. Elira stood in the middle of it and felt something large and complicated move through her chest, something she was going to spend a long time finding the right name for. Ronan was standing near the barn wall, watching her. She looked at him across the space of the barn, across all those people and lanterns and hay bales and the cold night pressing in outside, and whatever passed between them in that look was quiet enough that nobody in the room could have identified it, but real enough that she felt it in her sternum. She looked away first, because there was still work to do. There was always still work to do, but it was work she had chosen, in a life she was building, on ground that was, slowly, imperfectly, with significant gaps and at least one provision she'd invented on the spot in a yard while holding an axe, beginning to feel like hers. Cole left the valley on a Tuesday in early April. He did not announce his departure. He did not come to anyone's door to say that he was withdrawing his offer or that the valley had beaten him, because men like Cole did not frame things that way, not even to themselves. What happened was simply that his horses were gone from the Black Hollow livery one morning and his rooms at the boarding house were vacated, and Doris Peck at the dry goods store told Mara, who told Elira, that she had seen his wagon heading east on the county road just past dawn. Elira received this information while she was pouring coffee, and she set the pot down carefully and stood at the kitchen stove for a moment with her back to the room. She had expected to feel relief. What she felt instead was something more complicated. Not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but the particular flatness that follows sustained tension when the tension finally releases. Like a rope that's been pulled tight for so long that when it finally slackens, it doesn't spring back immediately. It just lies there, waiting to remember its own shape. He'll be back, Ronan said from the table, without looking up from his coffee. I know. She turned around. Not this season, but eventually. Eventually. He turned the cup in his hands. By then the cooperative will be a year old, and it'll either have proven itself or it won't. It will, she said. He looked at her. You're certain. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things now. Without the performance of confidence, and without the performance of uncertainty, just the actual calculation. I'm certain enough, she said, which is a different thing, but it's what I've got. He nodded slowly. That was enough for him, and she had learned enough about him to understand that it was genuine agreement rather than polite acceptance. Ronan Mercer did not do polite acceptance. When he disagreed with something, he said so, plainly, in the direct way of a man who had decided long ago that the social friction of honesty was cheaper than the accumulated cost of pretending. It was one of the things she had come to depend on, that directness. It had taken her a while to trust it. She had spent too many years around people whose plainness was a performance and whose honesty was selective. But she trusted it now. She trusted it the way she trusted the fence lines and the stored provisions and the cooperative document with its 9 signatures, as a thing that would be where she put it when she went back to look. Outside, the April morning was doing something that was almost, tentatively, generously, the beginning of spring. The snow in the yard had retreated to shadows and north-facing corners. The ground under it was dark and wet and beginning to smell like itself again, like soil and root systems, and the particular organic promise of things that had been dormant deciding to reconsider. Ivy was in the yard already, doing what Ivy did in the mornings now, which was a combination of practical chores and quiet observation of the world around her. She had taken to getting up early, earlier even than Ronan, and spending the first hour of daylight outside in her red wool coat, finished in February, fitted properly. after 2 adjustments. Moving through the yard with the purposeful self-sufficiency of a child who had learned that the morning hours belonged to her, and she intended to use them. Silas was still inside by the fire, eating his breakfast with the absorbed concentration he brought to anything he was currently interested in, which this week was a set of illustrated natural history pages that Elira had found in a box of donated books that Jessup had brought over in March. He had been studying them with the same focused attention he gave to his wooden animals, as if the knowing of something was itself a form of possession. Elira watched both of them from the kitchen window and felt the complicated thing again, different this time, warmer. Whatever she had built here, whatever this household had become across these 5 months of cold and difficulty and accumulated small decisions, it was real in the way that the land outside was real. Not clean, not perfect, full of things that still needed tending, but real, present, hers. She went outside to find Ivy. The girl was crouched at the edge of the yard where the snow had pulled back, examining something in the exposed ground with the focused interest she brought to most things. She looked up when Elira approached, and the look on her face was the one Elira had come to recognize as Ivy's version of pleased. Not a big expression, but present, a slight opening around the eyes. "There are crocuses," Ivy said. Elira crouched beside her, 3 small purple heads pushing through the dark soil at the base of the fence post, improbably delicate against the hard ground around them. "Mara planted bulbs there years ago," Elira said. "She mentioned it once, said she'd forgotten they were there until they came back one spring and surprised her." Ivy looked at the flowers for another moment. "Things come back," she said. Not philosophically, just as an observation, the way she catalogued facts. "Some things," Elira said, "the ones with deep enough roots." Ivy considered this. She had a way of sitting with statements before responding, turning them over to see all their sides, that Elira had come to appreciate. "Are we staying?" she asked. The question was direct, unadorned, carrying the weight of everything it actually meant. "Me and Silas. Are we staying here?" As a real thing. Not just until. Elira had been waiting for this question. She had been preparing for it in the way she prepared for most important things, thinking through it carefully so that when the moment came she could give the honest answer without hesitation, because Ivy deserved the honest answer without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "If that's what you want, this is your home. I'm not speaking for some future arrangement or some decision that hasn't been made yet. I'm telling you that Ronan and I both want you here, and that's not going to change when conditions change. And if the letter from Oregon comes back and there's family who wants to know you, that will be something you get to decide about, not something that gets decided for you." Ivy was quiet for a moment. She looked at the crocuses. "Silas already decided," she said. "He decided in January. He told me." "What did he say?" "He said this is where the horse lives, so this is home." Something in her voice was both fond and exasperated, the particular combination that older siblings develop for younger ones who arrive at correct conclusions through completely illogical routes. Elira almost laughed. "He's not wrong. He's usually not wrong," Ivy said. "He just gets there in a weird way." She stood up, brushing the mud from her knees with the practicality she brought to most physical things. "I decided in February, when you sat with me about the sewing." She paused. "I didn't say it then. I wasn't ready to say it." "That's all right. I'm saying it now." "I know." Elira stood beside her and looked at the 3 small crocuses at the base of the fence post, and thought about the particular nature of things that survive winter by going deep and waiting, and thought that there was something worth understanding in that which she didn't have the exact words for yet. "Come in when you're ready. Mara's making something she's been claiming is going to be better than anything she's made all winter, and I'm choosing to believe her." Ivy's mouth shifted toward something that was, on Ivy, a smile. "She says that every time." "She does." Elira turned back toward the cabin. "But she's also right every time, so—" She heard Ivy's boots on the ground behind her, following. The spring work hit like a wall, which was expected but still formidable when it arrived. The frozen months had stored up a considerable amount of work that now needed doing simultaneously. Fencing that had been damaged by the weight of snow and ice, cattle that needed moving to new pasture as the highland grasses began their slow return, planting schedules that had hard deadlines attached to them, and the first joint operations of the cooperative that were no longer theoretical but actual, requiring the 9 families to function as a coordinated unit for the first time under real conditions. It did not go smoothly. Nothing that involves 9 different families and decades of individual habit ever goes smoothly in its first real season of operation. There were disagreements about scheduling and about the valuation of different kinds of labor and about who had done more than their share in March and who owed what to the common account. There was a 3-day argument between the Calloway brothers and Amos Harker about a shared fence section on the eastern approach that had both historical context Elira didn't fully understand and fresh grievances about who had repaired what. There was a moment in the second week of April when she sat at the kitchen table at midnight with the cooperative's accounts spread out in front of her and genuinely could not see how the numbers were going to work before the summer revenue came in. She sat with that for a while. The lamp was low and the cabin was quiet. Ronan asleep, the children asleep, Mara asleep in her lean-to. And the numbers on the table were what they were, which was tighter than she had planned for. Then she recalculated, moved some things around, found a margin she had been accounting for conservatively that could be stretched if the timber operation started 2 weeks earlier than the schedule called for. The schedule would need to flex. Flexing the schedule meant a conversation with Schreiber, who ran the timber work, who did not like flexing schedules. She made a note and went to bed. The conversation with Schreiber was uncomfortable. He did not like flexing the schedule. He said so, plainly, and made several points about why the original timeline was the correct one, and deviating from it would create downstream problems. Some of his points were valid. She conceded the ones that were valid and held the ones that weren't, and they reached an adjusted schedule that neither of them was entirely satisfied with, which Ronan told her later was a sign that it was probably about right. "You're handling Schreiber," Ronan said one evening, in a tone that suggested he found this notable. "I'm negotiating with him," she said. "It's different. He agreed to the schedule adjustment, with conditions. He conditions everything. That he agreed at all." Ronan shook his head slightly. "He told my father to go to hell once. In 1871. My father was a reasonable man." "Schreiber isn't unreasonable," Elira said. "He's just precise. If you match his precision, he responds to it." Ronan looked at her with the expression she had come to privately identify as the one he made when she said something that rearranged his understanding of a situation he had thought he understood. It was a good expression. She had come to enjoy it, which she kept to herself. "When did you figure that out?" he said. "January," she said, "when he agreed to put his name on the cooperative." She picked up the accounts she'd been reviewing. He said, "Tell me what you need." That's a precise man asking for a precise answer, so I gave him one. Ronan considered this. "You watch people." "I always have." She turned a page in the accounts. It was the only way to know what was coming. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is it different now?" "Watching." She thought about the question. It deserved a real answer, not a quick one. "Before I was watching for threats," she said, "for what was going to be used against me or taken from me. Now I'm watching for—" She paused, finding the word. "Leverage. In the useful sense. What does someone need? What do they respond to? How do you build something they'll hold to?" She looked up at him. "It's the same skill, different purpose." He held her eyes for a moment. "Better purpose," he said. She looked back at the accounts. "Significantly," she agreed. The argument with Ronan happened in the 3rd week of April, and it was the first real one, not the careful formal negotiations of their early months, not the surface friction of adjusting to each other's habits, but an actual argument with raised voices and things said that were not entirely fair, and a door that was not quite slammed but was closed with a firmness that communicated the same thing. It was about Cade. Her brother had appeared again, 3rd time since November, and the pattern of his appearances had a predictable shape. He came when he needed something, or when his conscience accumulated enough weight that he needed to discharge some of it, and it was not always easy to tell which of those it was. This time he had come ostensibly to see how Elira was getting on, and in the course of that visit he had made a request that he presented as minor, a loan, he called it, from the cooperative's shared fund to cover a debt he'd run up in Black Hollow over the winter. Ronan had declined, flatly and without negotiation. Cade had left, and then Elira and Ronan had discussed it, and the discussion had not stayed level. "It's not your decision alone," she said. He's my brother. The cooperative fund is something I helped build. I should have been part of that conversation." The conversation lasted approximately 40 seconds and consisted of me saying no, Ronan said. His voice had the particular edge it got when he was holding patience against the pull of genuine frustration. There wasn't time to, "You didn't try to make time." She was standing by the window, and he was near the table, and the space between them felt wider than its actual distance. "You decided, and then you told me. That's the same thing that was done to me when I married you, and I need you to understand that." That landed. She watched it land. His jaw tightened and his eyes went somewhere interior for a moment, and when he looked back at her, the edge in his expression had changed from frustration to something more complicated. "That's not a fair comparison," he said. "I know it's not entirely fair," she said. "I'm saying it because I need you to feel how it sounds, not because it's exact." She turned from the window. "Kate is not a good person to give money to. I know that. I know it better than you do, but I needed to be part of deciding that." A long silence. "You're right," he said. The words came out measured but genuine. Ronan did not apologize easily. It was one of the places where he sometimes got himself into corners and stayed in them longer than he should. But when he got there without qualification. "I reacted to him being here, and I moved faster than I should have. Yes. I'll come to you first, if he comes back." "He'll come back," she said. "He always comes back." "I know." Another pause. "What would you have said to him about the loan?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I would have said no. But I would have said it in a way that left him less," she looked for the word, "less of a reason to be angry. You said it in a way that made him feel dismissed." "He is dismissed." "I is," she agreed. "But he's also my brother, and how I manage that relationship is mine to manage, even when he doesn't deserve the management." She held Ronan's eyes. "Do you understand the difference?" He did. She could see him working through it. The distinction between the correct outcome and the correct process for arriving at it. The way the person who does the thing sometimes matters as much as the thing being done. It was not a natural way for him to think. He was a man who moved towards solutions, and the politics of how you got to a solution were sometimes not the thing he kept in frame. "Yes," he said finally. "I understand it." "Good." She picked up her coat from the hook. "I'm going to check on the seedlings in the side garden. Mara thinks we started them too early, and I want to see if she's right." "Is she?" "Probably." She went out. She stood in the side garden for a while in the April afternoon, looking at the seedling trays lined up under the oilcloth cover, and she thought about the argument and the way it had gone and the way it had resolved, and she thought that it was the most honest conversation she had ever had with another adult about how she needed to be treated, and she had not apologized for any part of it, and the world had not collapsed. A pattern was developing. Every time she said the true thing and held it, the world failed to collapse. She was beginning to build a working theory from this data. Mara appeared at her elbow approximately 3 minutes later with the cup of coffee that was Mara's default response to most situations requiring acknowledgement. She did not say anything about what had clearly been audible from inside the cabin. She just handed Elira the cup and looked at the seedling trays. "Too early," Mara said. "I know," Elira said. "I'm looking anyway." Mara stood with her arms crossed. "He'll be better for that conversation." "I know that too. He's not good at being wrong." A pause. "He's good at acknowledging it, which is rarer, but the getting there is uncomfortable for him." "I noticed," Elira said. "His mother was the same way." Mara said it without editorializing, just information, the way she offered most things about Ronan's history. She'd dig herself into something and stay there past the point of reason. The difference was she didn't always come out. Elira thought about that. "He comes out." "He does." Mara took back the cup, drained the last of it herself. "That matters more than people think it does." They stood in the side garden in the mild April afternoon, the mountains showing the first patches of something that might eventually be green, and Elira thought that Mara was right, and that she had spent enough of her life around people who did not come out of the places they dug themselves into, and she understood very clearly now what the difference cost. April became May, and May was a different world. The highland in spring was the thing Ronan had tried to describe in January by firelight, and she understood now why the words had been insufficient, because the actual thing had a quality that language approached but didn't quite reach. The grasses came back in a particular shade of green that had the intensity of something that had been waiting a long time, and the timber on the upper ridge shifted from the severe gray-black of winter to something layered and alive. And the light in the afternoons had a warmth that felt almost personal, like something directed at you specifically. The cattle filled out. The seedlings, too early, as Mara had predicted, but salvageable, were replanted and began their proper growth. The first joint timber operation ran for 3 weeks on the upper ridge with crews from 4 different cooperative families. And it ran imperfectly, with the disagreements and inefficiencies of a new system, but it ran, and the volume they extracted together was more than any of them could have managed alone, and the revenue split reached everyone in the cooperative before the end of May. When the Harkers received their first cooperative payment, Betty Harker cried. She told Elira this matter-of-factly when she came to return a borrowed implement, said it without embarrassment or apology, just as information. "I cried," she said. "I didn't expect to. I knew the number, I knew it was coming, but when Amos put it on the table, I just—" She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "It meant we were going to be all right. Not rich, not fixed, but all right. I didn't know how much I needed to know that until I knew it." Elira understood this in a way she didn't try to express. "How is Amos?" she said instead. "Sleeping better," Bet said, which was everything. The Prentice family's garden came up strong, the seed quality they'd sourced through the cooperative making a visible difference in the early growth. And Margaret Prentice sent a note with Thomas when he came for the late May work session that said simply, "Thank you for the specifics." Elira kept the note in the cooperative's records because she thought it was the right kind of record to keep, the small human evidence that the structure was doing what they'd built it to do. Cole did not reappear. There were rumors from the county seat about his operations in other areas. A family in the Creston Range had gone to court about a contract dispute with one of his subsidiary companies, and the territorial paper had run a brief notice about it. But he did not come back to the Black Hollow Valley, not that spring. Elira was not surprised, and she was not entirely relieved. She had said to Ronan that he would come back eventually, and she meant it, and the cooperative's second year would be the real test of whether what they'd built could hold against a more patient version of the same pressure. But that was a future problem. She had learned, over these months, to hold future problems in their appropriate place, accounted for but not dragged forward, not allowed to colonize the present with their weight. Ronan's birthday was in May. She found this out from Mara, who mentioned it with the studied casualness of a woman who had decided that someone ought to do something about it and had decided it was not going to be her. Elira made a point of noting the date, and on the morning of it she produced a cake from the oven. Not a perfect cake. The top had a lean to it from an uneven heat distribution in the stove she hadn't fully compensated for, and set it on the table before he came in for breakfast. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. "Mara told me," Elira said. "Mara keeps her own counsel," he said. "Mara has opinions about what's appropriate." He came to the table and sat down, looked at the cake for a moment. The lean to it was significant enough that Silas had already noticed and was watching it with the expression of a person waiting to see if it would commit to a direction. "How old are you?" Ivy said, appearing from the far side of the cabin with her direct practicality. 36, Ronan said. Ivy considered this the way she considered most numerical information, evaluating its significance. "That's not very old," she concluded. "Thank you," he said, completely serious. Elira cut the cake and served it, lean side compensated for by cutting the pieces at an angle, and they ate it at the breakfast table in the May morning, with the door open to the warm air, and the sound of the cattle on the slope, and the particular quality of light that this valley produced in spring, which she understood now as Ronan had understood it, from the inside. "It's good," Ronan said about the cake. "The top is wrong," she said. "The inside isn't." He finished his piece. "The inside is what matters." She looked at him across the table, across the children and the breakfast things, and the ordinary accumulated detail of the household they had built, across a winter that had required everything from both of them. He was looking back at her with that expression she'd stopped trying to catalog and had started simply recognizing as his, direct and unperformed, and carrying something it didn't dress up in easier language. She thought about the word she had been holding since January, the one that needed evidence before she'd spend it. She had been gathering evidence all winter. She had enough now. She had had enough for a while, if she was being honest with herself, which she was trying to be. She was not going to say it at the breakfast table with cake on the plates, and Silas examining the structural integrity of the remaining portion with a carved horse and ivy already moving on to the morning's practical concerns. But she was going to say it, not today, soon, when the time was the kind of quiet that deserved it. The first summer night warm enough to sit outside happened in late May, and they sat outside, just the two of them, the children long asleep, and Mara in her lean-to, and the valley spread out below the homestead in the blue dark, the mountains against the sky, and the first real warmth of the year on the air. They didn't talk much. They had gotten comfortable with silence in the way that people get comfortable with silence only when the silence itself has become a form of communication. When sitting next to someone without filling the air means something, when the choosing of that particular company and that particular quiet is itself a statement. At some point he put his hand over hers on the bench between them. Not a motion toward anything, just that. His hand covering hers, staying there. She turned her palm up and let her fingers close around his. They sat like that for a long time in the warm dark, and the valley was quiet beneath them, and the mountains held their shapes against the sky, the way they always had and always would, and Elira Vane, Elira Mercer, and she was beginning to make the name her own, sat on the porch of a home she had fought for, and thought about January and February, and the long cold and all the small choices that had accumulated into this, into right now, into a hand she was choosing to hold. She did not say the word yet, but she was holding it the way she held the cooperative document, the way she held Ivy's question answered, and Silas's carved horse, and the crocuses at the base of the fence post, and the look on Ronan's face when she said something that rearranged his understanding. She was holding it like something she planned to keep. The summer passed the way good things sometimes pass. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific weight of time being actually used rather than merely endured. The cooperative's first full season ran through June and July with the grinding imperfection of anything new and real. There were weeks when the shared labor schedule produced friction that required Elira to sit with 2 or 3 people at once and work through the kind of disagreement that has no clean answer, only a negotiated one that everyone can live with. There were weeks when the timber operation ran behind because of weather, and behind schedule meant behind on the revenue projections, and behind on revenue meant the cooperative's common account went thinner than comfortable, and thin accounts made people anxious. And anxious people said things at the fence line that required careful management before they became the kind of thing that stuck. She managed it. Not effortlessly. There was nothing effortless about any of it, and she had stopped expecting effortlessness as a standard sometime around February. When she'd understood that effortlessness was a story, people told to make the hard work of others look natural. She managed it with the tools she had. Attention, honesty, the ability to sit in a room with someone who was angry or frightened and stay steady until the temperature came down enough to think. Ronan handled the physical operations, the cattle movements, the timber crews, the fence work, the 100 practical decisions that a Highland ranch required every week, with the same methodical competence he'd always had, and he was better now at telling her when something affected the cooperative's shared interests before he acted on it rather than after. Not always. He still moved faster than he should have sometimes, still got himself into corners on things, and had to work his way back out, still had the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent most of his adult life making decisions alone and found the habit difficult to revise. But the revision was happening, slowly, imperfectly, with occasional backtracking, the way most real change happens. They argued 4 more times that summer. Real arguments, not the surface friction of early winter. Each one was about something specific, and each one resolved into something more honest than where they'd started. And Elira came to understand that the arguing was not a sign of the thing breaking, but a sign of the thing being alive. That people who never fought were people who were managing each other, not knowing each other, and she had been managed enough for one lifetime. What she had not expected was how much she would come to value the ordinary days. The days that had no crisis in them, no coal on the road, and no accounts to reconcile at midnight, and no family dispute requiring diplomacy. The days that were just the homestead, and the work, and the children, and Mara's running commentary on everything, and Ronan at the table in the evenings, and the mountains holding their shapes outside the window. She had spent so much of her life surviving the exceptional that she'd never had enough of the ordinary to know what it was worth. It was worth everything. It turned out to be worth everything. Well, the letter from Oregon arrived in August. It was addressed to Ivy and Silas Merrick. Elira had not known their last name until the letter arrived, which was its own kind of thing to sit with. The realization that she had been caring for these children for 7 months without ever having occasion to ask their full names because it had simply not been the relevant thing. And it was from the father's brother, a man named Gerald Merrick, who ran a farming operation outside Portland. Elira put it on the table and looked at it for a long time before she called Ivy. Ivy came, saw the letter, and sat down across from it with the careful composure she used for things that mattered. She looked at the envelope. She looked at Elira. "You haven't opened it." "It's yours to open," Elira said. Ivy picked it up. She turned it over once, the way Silas turned his carved horse over when he was thinking, and Elira understood suddenly where the boy had learned that particular gesture. Then she opened it and read it, and her face during the reading was the controlled face she used when she was working very hard not to let the outside see the inside. She set the letter down. "He wants us to come," she said. "He says we're family and he has room and it would be right." Elira waited. "He doesn't ask what we want," Ivy said. "He says what would be right. Those are different things." She looked at the letter again. "He sounds like a decent person. I think he probably is. I think he genuinely believes taking us in would be the correct thing to do." She paused. "I don't want to go to Portland." "Then you don't go to Portland," Elira said. "It's not that simple." "Tell me why." Ivy pressed the letter flat on the table with her palm. "Because if he's a good person doing what he thinks is right, saying no feels like we're rejecting something offered honestly." Her brow creased slightly. "I don't want to be ungrateful for a real offer." Elira thought about how to say the next thing. "Gratitude for an offer and acceptance of an offer are not the same obligation," she said. "A good person making a genuine offer deserves a genuine response. The genuine response is that you have a home here and you want to stay in it, and you are grateful for his reaching out." She held Ivy's eyes. "That's not rejection. That's honesty. Which is what he gave you, and what you can give back." Ivy sat with that. Outside, the August afternoon was warm and the sound of Silas somewhere in the yard was audible. He'd developed a habit of conducting quiet conversations with the wooden animals that he may or may not have believed were private, and the mountains were the particular summer gold they turned in late afternoon. "Will you help me write to him?" Ivy said. "Yes, right now, if you want." "Not right now." She folded the letter carefully. "I need to think about what I want to say, so it's honest." "Take the time you need." Ivy nodded. She stood up, tucking the letter into the pocket of her dress. She started for the door, then stopped. Without turning around, she said, "I decided a long time ago, about staying. I just needed to know there was still a choice." She paused. "There's always a choice. That's what you taught me." She went out into the yard and Elira heard her say something to Silas, something practical, an elder sister in tone, and Silas's response, which was, whatever it was, she couldn't make out the words, and the particular quality of that sound, 2 children in a yard in August, was something she was not able to be analytical about. It simply landed in her chest and stayed there. She sat at the table alone for a while and thought about a girl standing at the entrance to a chapel who could not make her feet move forward, who had no practice in choosing and therefore no practice in knowing that she could. She thought about what it had taken to learn that. The long cold and this hard work, and the arguments, and the cooperative document with its 9 signatures and all the kitchen table conversations, and the calf finding its legs in the lamplight at 2 in the morning, and everything else that had accumulated across these months into the specific weight of a life she recognized as her own. She thought, if I had known, in November, what it would cost to get here, would I have been able to walk through the door? She didn't know the answer. She suspected not. She suspected she had needed not to know, had needed to move through it day by day without the full view of what was ahead, finding each next thing only when she was already standing in it. That might be the only way anyone ever builds anything real, not with full knowledge and full preparation and a clear view of the destination, but step by step, with incomplete information and imperfect tools, trusting the direction more than the certainty. She got up from the table and went back to work. But Mara got sick in September. Not dramatically. Mara did nothing dramatically. She developed a cough at the beginning of the month that she dismissed with the authority she brought to most things she wanted to dismiss. And she continued her routines with the same methodical attention she always gave them. And it was only in the second week, when Elira noticed that Mara was sitting down between tasks in a way she never had before, that the conversation happened. "How long?" Elira said. She didn't dress it up. Mara didn't respond well to things dressed up. "Long enough that I know what it is." Mara was sitting at the table with her hands around a cup of tea she'd stopped pretending was just for warmth. It's the lung. I've had it 2 years. 2 years, Elira said. I'm not interested in your reaction to that. I know you're not. Elira sat across from her. What do you need? I need you to stop looking at me like that. A pause. And I need you to know that the household runs without me, that you know where everything is and how everything works, and you don't need me to hold it together. She said this last part with a specific directness that was about more than practicality. That's what I need, to know it runs. It runs, Elira said. It runs because you built it. Everything I know about this place I learned from watching you. Mara made the sound that was her version of being moved without being willing to admit to it. I taught you what I knew. You did the rest yourself. Mara, I'm not dying this week, the old woman said, with the bluntness of someone who had decided that precision was more respectful than softness. I have time yet, but I wanted you to know, so you weren't surprised later. They sat with that for a moment, the two of them, in the kitchen that Mara had run for 15 years, and that was now as much Elira's as anyone's. Do you want Ronan to know? Elira asked. He already knows. Mara drank her tea. He's known for a year. He didn't tell you because I asked him not to until I was ready. She looked at Elira steadily. He keeps his word. I know he does, Elira said. After that, things didn't change dramatically. Mara continued her routines, adjusted for what her body would allow, and not one adjustment beyond that. Elira picked up the things that needed picking up without making a performance of it, and the household absorbed the shift the way a household does when the people in it are paying attention to each other rather than to the appearance of things. Ronan did not talk about it directly, because he was a man who processed things internally and whose grief tended to come out sideways, in extra hours at the work, in the particular careful way he spoke to Mara in passing, in the harness piece he repaired 3 times in 1 week, when it only needed repairing once. Elira let him process it the way he needed to. She understood now that loving someone included understanding the shape of their grief, and not trying to reshape it into something more convenient. That was something she had learned here. Not from a book, and not from being told. From paying attention. Cole came back in October. He came quietly, which was different from before, and that difference was information. He did not arrive in town with associates and horses stabled publicly and room taken at the boarding house. He came alone, made 1 visit to Deller, and Deller sent a rider to the homestead the same afternoon. Elira and Ronan went to Deller's together. Clara met them at the door and had coffee on the table before they were seated, which Clara always did, and which Elira had come to appreciate as its own form of alliance. He's changed his offer, Deller said, without preamble. He had a letter on the table that he pushed toward them. He's not trying to buy the valley anymore. He wants a partnership in the timber operation. Minority stake. He provides capital investment for equipment. The cooperative maintains operational control. Elira read the letter. She read it twice. It's a real offer, she said when she finished. It is, Deller agreed. His expression was the careful one he used when he had already been thinking about something for several hours and had not arrived at a conclusion he was comfortable with. Different from before. The terms are... He paused. They're not bad terms on paper. On paper, Ronan said. On paper, Deller repeated. The question is what's underneath them. Elira set the letter down. She thought about Garrett Cole, about the man who had come to her yard in March, and assessed her with the recording attention of someone cataloging information for later use. She thought about what a minority stake in the cooperative's timber operation would actually provide him with, not control, not yet, but access. To the accounts, to the relationships, to the internal workings of something that was currently opaque to him. A minority stake was a foot in the door that could, with patience, become the whole door. No, she said. Both men looked at her. Not because the terms are bad, because the terms are deliberately good. She looked at Deller. He spent 6 months watching what we built and understanding what he did wrong the first time. He came in too aggressive, and it unified people against him. This time he's coming in as a partner. The capital investment is real, and the equipment would help the operation. She paused. And in 18 months, when he has a seat at the table and relationships with the families and a working understanding of the cooperative structure, he'll start finding the places where the terms give him leverage. Quietly. Without triggering the defense mechanism that stopped him the first time. A silence. You're saying he's smarter now, Deller said. I'm saying he learned. She held his eyes. Which means we need to have learned too. Deller looked at the letter. He looked at Clara briefly, the quick conjugal exchange of people who have been making decisions together long enough that a glance can contain a paragraph. Clara gave him nothing visible, which Elira suspected was its own kind of answer. We take it to the cooperative, Ronan said. Full meeting. Everyone sees the letter. Yes, Elira said. And they decide. All of them. Together. The meeting happened 2 days later in Deller's barn, which had become, unofficially, the cooperative's meeting space across these months. All 9 families. The letter was passed around and read by everyone who could read it, and summarized for those whose reading was limited. Elira laid out her analysis in the same plain terms she'd used before, not assuming the conclusion, just walking through the logic of what the offer actually represented beneath its surface. Schreiber said, the equipment would be genuinely useful. Yes, Elira agreed, but the access it purchases for him is more valuable to Cole than the equipment is to us. That's my read. Schreiber looked at the letter one more time and handed it back. Then no, it was not unanimous. 2 families needed more conversation before they arrived at the same place, and those conversations happened on the margins of the meeting and took the better part of an hour. But they arrived, and the cooperative sent a letter back to Cole that was written by Elira and reviewed by Ronan and signed by all 9 families, declining the offer with specific and respectful language that made clear they understood exactly what had been proposed and had considered it seriously before declining. Cole did not respond. He did not come back that autumn. Elira did not believe he was gone for good. She had stopped believing in the permanent departure of problems. Problems, in her experience, had better stamina than solutions and required constant tending. What she believed was that the cooperative was stronger for having faced him twice and refused him twice, and that the second refusal had been smarter than the first, and that if he came back a third time, they would be smarter still. That would have to be enough. It was enough. Mara passed in December, 2 days before the first serious snow of the new winter. She went in her sleep, in her lean-to, in the bed she had slept in for 15 years, which was what she had said she wanted when Elira had asked her once, in October, in the plain way that Mara appreciated being asked about things. She had wanted to be in her own place, in her own bed, without a production made of it. The production was made anyway, by the people who loved her, because that was what people did, and Mara had known it would happen, and had accepted it as the cost of having been present in people's lives long enough to matter to them. Ronan took it hard in the sideways way. He took hard things. He worked for 3 days straight after, longer hours than the December light justified, and Elira let him work and made sure there was food when he came in, and did not push at the grief before it was ready to be spoken. On the 4th day he came in at noon, which was unusual, and sat at the table without taking his coat off, and she put coffee in front of him and sat across from him and waited. She used to talk to my father's photograph, he said. There was a photograph on the shelf in her room. I don't know when she started doing it, but I heard her sometimes. Not the words, just the sound of her talking to it. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I thought about telling her once that I thought about saying something, but it seemed like it was hers. Something that was just hers. It was, Elira said. I miss her already. He said it plainly, without apology for the plainness of it. I know she was old and she was ready, and the winter's better than some other things she could have had. But I miss her. I know, Elira said. I do too. He looked up from his coffee. You didn't know her long. Long enough to know what I was learning from her. She held his eyes. Some people don't need a long time to show you what they're made of. I was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same gesture from the May night on the porch, and she turned her palm up and held his hand, and they sat like that for a while in Mara's kitchen, in Mara's house, which was their house now, and would carry her in it for as long as the walls stood. They buried Mara on a clear December morning with the first snow on the ground and most of the valley present, because Mara had been in the Black Hollow Valley long enough to have touched more lives than any of them had fully accounted for until she was gone. Deller came, Schreiber came, and stood at the back with his hat in his hands and his expression doing the work it always did, processing something deep without making it public. The Harkers, the Prentices, the Calloways, Jessup, Strand, all of them. Ivy stood beside Elira through the whole of it and did not cry, which was not because she didn't feel it, but because Ivy's grief had always been a private internal structure that she did not put on display. She held Silas's hand, and Silas, who was old enough now to understand what death was, and young enough that he understood it most clearly in terms of specific absence, held his carved horse in his other hand and was very quiet. Afterward, when the Valley families had gone, and it was just the four of them, 5, if you counted Ronan, which made it 5, Ivy said, "She knew we were staying." "Yes," Elira said. "I'm glad she knew." "So am I." Silas looked at his carved horse. "She knew about the horse," he said. It was such a specific Silas statement, so particular, so focused on the concrete fact of the object, that it landed on all of them at once, the way something small and true sometimes does, arriving like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples moving out wider than the original thing. "She knew about the horse," Elira said. "She knew everything that mattered." The autumn that Elira had been in the valley a full year, she and Ronan sat on the porch on a clear October evening, and the valley spread out below them in the way it did at that hour, golden and enormous and full of its own complicated life. The cooperative was in its second year. The Prentice family had built a small addition to their cabin from the first-year timber revenue. Ivy had learned over the summer to help with the cooperative's accounts, sitting beside Elira at the table in the evenings with the same focused attention she brought to everything, asking questions that were precise and absorbing the answers whole. Silas had grown 3 inches and had developed an interest in the cattle that was evolving, slowly, from abstract appreciation into genuine practical knowledge, guided by Ronan with the patient wordlessness of a man teaching someone something he loved. The valley was not fixed. There were still families who struggled in ways the cooperative could only partially address, and there were still seasons that were harder than the ones before them, and there were still the distant possibilities of Cole and his kind, patient, and strategic in ways that required constant vigilance. The cooperative document had been updated 4 times in a year, each update a scar from a disagreement that had been worked through and resolved, and the document was better for its scars. None of it was finished. That was the thing about real things. They were never finished. They just continued, and you either continued with them or you didn't. She was continuing. On that October evening, Ronan reached into his coat pocket and produced something she didn't immediately recognize, a small, careful thing, and she looked at it in the fading light and understood that it was a ring, handcrafted, silver, not perfect, the workmanship of a man who knew his limits and had worked within them to produce something honest. He placed it in her open hand. "I didn't buy this," he said. "I made it. Over the summer. I know I'm not a jeweler." He was looking at her with the particular expression he had when he had decided to say a true thing and was staying with the decision. "I want you to choose this, the life here, me, the children, the whole, all of it." He paused. "Not because it was what happened to you, because it's what you want." She looked at the ring in her palm, at the workmanship of it. Imperfect, yes, the kind of imperfect that came from real hands making a real thing, rather than from a lack of care. She could see the care in it. She had learned, over a year, to see the things Ronan did with care rather than words. She looked at this man who had whispered 6 words to her in a chapel when she had been expecting cruelty, who had bought red wool and left it on a table and walked away from it, who had held her hand on a May porch without demanding it mean anything beyond the holding, who had argued with her and been wrong and said so and come back, who had taught a small boy about cattle with the wordless patience of someone passing on something that matters, who had made a ring over a summer because he couldn't say in any other language what he wanted to say. She thought about what it meant to choose, not to accept, not to endure, not to survive, to choose, actively, with full knowledge and full awareness of what came with it. The imperfections, and the arguments, and the gaps in the structure, and the work that never finished, and the grief that sat beside the joy and the cold winters that required everything you had. She thought about what it meant to want a life rather than simply inhabit it. She put the ring on her own finger. "Yes," she said, not the performed yes of a person saying what was expected. The plain, certain yes of a woman who had learned at considerable cost to know her own mind and trust it. He looked at the ring on her hand and then at her face, and the expression he had was the one that had no word she knew for it, the one that was direct and unperformed and carrying something large in a very quiet container. "Okay," he said. She almost laughed. "Okay? I mean..." He stopped. Something shifted in his expression towards something warmer, more unguarded than she usually saw from him. "Yes. I mean... yes." Everything I meant to say when I made the ring, all of that. I know, she said. I know what you meant. The valley held its evening colors below them, and somewhere inside the cabin Silas was talking to his wooden animals in the quiet voice he used when he thought no one could hear. And Ivy was probably at the table with the accounts, because Ivy approached evenings productively, and the mountains were the particular color they turned in the last light, which she now understood from the inside, which was the only way to understand anything that mattered. She sat on her porch in her valley and thought about November, 1 year ago, when she had been a woman who could not make her feet move forward, who had never been asked what she wanted and had therefore forgotten, mostly, that wanting was something available to her, who had been managed and moved and traded until she had mistaken the shape of a cage for the shape of the world. She thought about what it had taken to learn the difference. It had taken cold and hard work, and a document with 9 signatures and children in the yard, and an old woman's plain commentary, and 4 real arguments, and a community of people who held together when they had every reason not to, and the specific daily practice of choosing, over and over, even when the choice was small and the stakes seemed modest and nobody was watching, especially when nobody was watching. That was the lesson she had bought with the hardest year of her life, and she intended to keep it. The choosing didn't stop when the crisis ended. The choosing was the thing itself, the ongoing, unremarkable daily act of deciding who you were and what you were building and whether you were going to hold to it when the conditions made holding difficult. There were people in this valley who had watched her arrive as a crying bride sold to settle a debt, and who had watched something else happen across these months, and who had drawn their own conclusions about what that meant. She was not interested in those conclusions. She was not interested in the story other people told about her. She was interested in the story she was telling herself, from the inside in real time, with all its gaps and wrong turns and moments where the numbers didn't add up, and the provisions ran short, and the man across the table got himself into a corner he had to work his way back out of, and the children needed things she didn't always know how to give, and the work went on regardless of whether she was ready for it. That story, with all of that in it, was hers. She had built it herself, not alone. She understood that now, that the myth of alone was itself a kind of cage, that the people you let in were not a weakness in the structure, but load-bearing parts of it. Not without cost, not without the specific education of a winter that required everything and gave back something she could not have anticipated in November, when she had no practice in choosing and therefore no way to know what it would feel like to finally begin. But hers. The first stars were coming up over the eastern ridge, one at a time, the way they always did in this valley. Not all at once, but gradually, the dark revealing them by degrees. The full picture only visible when you had the patience to wait for the light to finish changing. Alira Mercer sat on her porch and watched them appear, and did not rush the watching, because she had learned across a year that had cost her more than she'd budgeted for and returned more than she'd known to ask for, that the things worth seeing rarely arrived all at once. They came the way spring came to the highlands, slowly, imperfectly. And then, one morning, undeniably.